Hi and welcome. I'm Midnight Truth, and I'm so glad you've joined me tonight. Wherever you are right now, whether it's the calm of your bed, the quiet of your couch, or just finding a still moment, I want you to know that this space is for you. Take a deep breath in, and as you breathe out, imagine releasing the weight of the day, letting all that heaviness fade. Feel your mind slowing, your body unwinding. There's no rush, no expectations, just this quiet moment suspended in time. If you'd like, close your eyes and picture yourself in a serene place. Perhaps it's an old library with dim lighting, shelves filled with forgotten stories, or a quiet room where the faintest whisper of wind brushes through the window. Whatever place feels right, let it surround you. And if you're feeling this peacefulness, I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from or if you tap the like button. It's a small thing, but it helps bring more people to this quiet space. And if you're drawn to more stories like this, go ahead and subscribe. Only if it feels right. Tonight's story is calm, yet with a hint of mystery, perfect to guide you toward a deep, restful sleep. So, get comfortable, relax, and let's begin. I stood on the cracked driveway, staring at the house. It was older than I expected, with faded green paint peeling at the edges and ivy crawling up one side. The front porch sagged slightly, and the windows had a dull, clouded look, as if they hadn't been cleaned in decades. Still, it was mine, for better or worse. After the divorce, I needed a fresh start, something cheap and quiet where I could regroup and figure out what the hell came next. This house in the middle of nowhere seemed perfect. At least, it had when I saw the listing online. In person, it was, well, it had potential. That's what I kept telling myself as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was stale, carrying the faint, unpleasant scent of mildew and something metallic. The wooden floors creaked under my boots, and a draft came from somewhere deeper in the house, chilling the back of my neck. I glanced around. The entryway opened into a living room with a sagging couch left behind by the previous tenant. Beyond that, a kitchen with outdated appliances and faded yellow wallpaper that might have been cheerful once. A narrow staircase wound up to the second floor. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I spent the first day unpacking and getting a feel for the place. The quirks were almost charming at first. The way the floorboards groaned with every step. The way the front door stuck no matter how hard I shoved it. The faint rattling noise that came from the vents when the wind picked up. By the time the sun set, I was exhausted. I set up my bed in the master bedroom upstairs, a cozy enough space with a single window overlooking the overgrown backyard. The walls were painted a muted blue, and there was an old wardrobe against one wall. It smelled faintly of mothballs, but I figured I'd deal with that later. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling. Every creak and groan seemed amplified in the dark. Once or twice, I thought I heard footsteps, but I brushed it off as my imagination. Old houses like this made noises, right? I told myself I'd get used to it. The next morning, I met Mrs. Wilkes, my neighbor. She was in her 70s, with white hair pulled into a tight bun and a knitted cardigan that looked older than me. She brought over a plate of cookies as a welcome gift. Not many folks move into that house, she said as I took the plate from her. Her voice was raspy, her tone carrying a hint of disapproval. Oh, I tried to sound casual, but her words made me pause. She squinted at me, as if deciding whether or not to say more. Strange things happen there, always have. Last couple who lived there moved out in the middle of the night, left everything behind. Before them, a young man. He ran out screaming about curses and shadows. Said he wouldn't step foot in there again. I laughed nervously. I guess old houses have their quirks. She didn't laugh. Just be careful, she said after a long pause. And if you hear something at night, don't go looking. Mrs. Wilkes' words lingered with me long after she left. I tried to laugh them off, brushing her warnings aside as small-town superstition or an old woman's attempt to spook the newcomer. Still, the way she'd said it, don't go looking, gave me a faint chill. I put the cookies on the kitchen counter and shook it off. This was my house now. The next few days were uneventful. I settled into a routine, unpacking boxes, wiping down surfaces, and fixing small things here and there. The faucet in the bathroom dripped constantly. The front door needed a proper shove to close, and the light in the hallway flickered every time I turned it on. All fixable, all normal. Or so I told myself. On the third night, the noises started again. It was just after midnight when I woke to a sound like heavy footsteps coming from the floor below. For a moment, I lay perfectly still, my heart pounding. Then I told myself it was the house settling, or maybe even the wind rattling something loose. When the sound came again, louder this time, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I crept downstairs. Every step a symphony of groans and creaks. My phone's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the living room and kitchen. Both were empty, nothing out of place. I stood there for a while, straining to hear anything else, but the house was silent. Eventually, I chalked it up to my imagination and went back to bed. The next morning, I called a handyman to look at the draft in the upstairs hallway. The chill there had become unbearable, seeping through the walls and into the air. It was worse near the attic door, which I hadn't yet opened. The handyman was a wiry man in his 40s named Carl. He had a no-nonsense air about him as he inspected the attic hatch. "Doesn't look like it's been opened in years," he muttered, running a hand along the edges. "Could be insulation problems. Want me to take a look?" I hesitated. The thought of opening that attic filled me with a vague, unexplainable dread. But I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I nodded. "Sure, go ahead." Carl fetched a ladder from his truck and climbed up, pushing open the hatch with a grunt. A thick cloud of dust cascaded down, and I coughed, waving it away. "Not much up here," he called down after a moment. "Couple of boxes, some old furniture. Looks like someone was storing junk." I relaxed a little, relieved that nothing sinister was lurking up there. Carl climbed down, brushing dust off his overalls. "I'll seal up the cracks, see if that helps with the draft. Might take a couple of hours." While Carl worked, I decided to check out the small local library. It was a short drive into town, and I figured I could grab a coffee while I was out. The librarian, a cheerful woman named Sarah, greeted me with a smile when I asked about the history of my house. "That old place," she said, tilting her head. "I think we've got some records. It's been there forever, you know. Used to belong to a man named Alistair Moore. Bit of a recluse. They say he was into some odd things." "What kind of odd things?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. Sarah shrugged. "You know how small towns are. Stories get passed around. Some folks said he was obsessed with the occult. Books on rituals, symbols carved into the walls, that sort of thing. Others said he was just a lonely old man who liked to keep to himself. Either way, no one really knows what happened to him. He just disappeared one day." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, but I tried to hide it. "Do you have anything on him?" "Records, maybe." "Not much, but you're welcome to look through the archives. They're in the back." I spent the next hour flipping through old newspapers and town records. Most of it was mundane, property listings, obituaries, announcements. Then I found a yellowed article from 1953. The headline read, asterisk, "Local recluse missing after alleged ritual." Asterisk, according to the article, Alistair Moore had been reported missing after neighbors complained of strange noises coming from his house. When the police investigated, they found no sign of him, only a series of symbols drawn in chalk on the floors and walls. The case had been left open but eventually forgotten. I left the library feeling unsettled. When I got home, Carl was finishing up. He gave me a quick rundown of the repairs he'd made, then left without much fanfare. That night, I went to bed early, trying not to think about the attic or Alistair Moore. The footsteps started again around 2 a.m. This time, they were louder, closer. It was the creaking floorboards that first woke me. Slow, deliberate steps echoing from the hallway outside my bedroom. My eyes snapped open, my breath catching in my throat. The air in the room was unnaturally cold, a biting chill that made my skin prickle. I lay still, straining to hear the footsteps again, hoping they were just a product of my overactive imagination. But no, there they were, unmistakable. A soft thud, followed by another, each step closer than the last. My pulse quickened. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, too loud in the silence. The coldness in the room grew more intense, like it was pressing in from all sides. The floor outside my door groaned under weight. Whoever, or whatever, was walking out there was no longer trying to hide. I gathered every ounce of courage I had. Sitting up in bed, my feet cold against the floor. My breath fogged the air in front of me, and I could see shadows moving under the doorframe. Then, all at once, the footsteps stopped. I waited, my muscles tensed, every nerve on edge. A soft shuffling followed, as if something or someone was standing just beyond the threshold. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The presence was unmistakable. It was close. I gripped the edge of my bed, my knuckles white. My mind screamed at me to get up, to open the door, to see what was out there. But I didn't move. I couldn't. A cold, deep terror rooted me to the spot, keeping me paralyzed in the dark. Then, as if it had been waiting for the right moment, I heard a faint whisper. Go. It wasn't a voice I recognized. The tone was thin and hollow, like it came from the walls themselves, or maybe from the space just between them. I flinched, my stomach dropping. I couldn't take it anymore. I shot out of bed and bolted for the door, flinging it open with a violent motion. The hallway was empty, just a faint glow of moonlight spilling through the windows at the end of the corridor. No footsteps, no shadows, nothing. I stood in the middle of the hallway, my breath shallow, trembling. The coldness still lingered in the air, but there was no sign of whatever had been there moments ago. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I felt it on the back of my neck, a constant, suffocating presence. I stumbled back to my bedroom, closing the door behind me. My mind raced. The whisper, the footsteps, what had I just heard? The rest of the night passed in a blur. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to sleep but too exhausted to stay awake. The house was silent now, but the fear remained, clinging to the edges of my thoughts. In the morning, I tried to convince myself it had all been a dream. Maybe I'd just been too tired, too anxious. The house was old, and old houses had a way of playing tricks on you. But when I went downstairs, something caught my eye. The front door was ajar. I knew I had locked it the night before. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart pounding again. It was an odd thing for me to miss, yet there it was. The door was open, just a crack. I couldn't remember hearing it open during the night. The wind hadn't been strong enough to push it. Had someone come in? I checked the house carefully. Every window was locked. The back door, too, was secure, but the feeling lingered. Someone had been here. The open door lingered in my mind all day. I couldn't shake the thought that something, had been in the house with me. The way the front door had creaked open on its own sent a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. I went through the motions of my usual routine, but it was hard to focus. Every creak, every faint sound from the house made my pulse quicken. I couldn't relax. I checked the locks twice, then 3 times, but nothing eased the unease gnawing at me. When night fell, I hesitated before going upstairs to bed. The thought of the attic door kept circling back to me, that cold draft coming from the hallway, the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just the door, it was the whole house. It felt wrong, like the air was thicker than it should be, like something was pressing in from all sides. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. This was just nerves. Old houses did strange things, and my mind was probably making mountains out of molehills. But when I climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The air felt heavier, colder, more suffocating. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard the faintest shuffle, the softest drag of something heavy across the floorboards. It was too quiet, too still. Then I heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they were coming from upstairs. My heart leapt into my throat, and I bolted upright in bed. The heavy, deliberate steps echoed down the hallway. They were slow, almost methodical. I could feel the presence approaching my bedroom, the weight of each footfall vibrating through the floor. I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to speak. The steps stopped just outside my door. I strained to hear my breath coming in shallow gasps. I felt the temperature drop even further, the air turning biting cold. It was as if the whole room had been filled with ice. And then, as if in response to my terror, the door to the attic creaked open. The sound was unmistakable, a long, drawn-out groan of old wood. It wasn't a sound the wind could make. It wasn't a sound of the house settling. No, this was different. Something was up there. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I couldn't stay in that room another second. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move. I grabbed my phone off the nightstand, the flashlight illuminating the hallway as I crept toward the attic stairs. Every step was a struggle. My body wanted to turn back, to run, but some horrible compulsion, pulled me forward. When I reached the attic door, I paused. The air felt thick and suffocating, and I could swear I heard something moving in the dark above. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was stuck, almost as if something on the other side was holding it shut. I pushed harder, gritting my teeth. The door groaned, but it opened just a crack. The faint light from the hallway barely cut through the darkness, but I could see the outline of the attic steps leading upward, blackness beyond them. The heavy, stale air that drifted from the attic smelled of dust, decay, and something else, something faintly metallic. I couldn't stand it anymore. I took a deep breath, forcing my legs to carry me up the stairs. The steps creaked under my weight, but I couldn't stop. My mind was racing, screaming at me to turn back, to leave the house, but my feet kept moving. At the top of the stairs, I reached the small landing. There, in the far corner of the attic, I saw it, a pile of old, forgotten furniture, crates stacked high, and something else that didn't belong. It was a small table, a wooden table, covered with symbols. I stepped closer, unable to look away. The symbols were familiar. They matched the ones I had seen in the old newspaper article about Alistair Moore. They were etched into the wood, carved deep, some of them overlapping, others forming strange, unreadable shapes. My fingers brushed against the table, and the instant I touched it, a cold shock ran through my body. The temperature in the attic dropped even further, the air thickening with an oppressive weight. I heard it again, the whisper, "Leave." The voice was colder this time, almost a hiss, like it was coming from the walls themselves. I jerked my hand away, heart pounding in my chest. I turned to flee, but before I could move, something slammed against the door, rattling the walls of the house. The force of it shook the attic, and the furniture rattled violently. The door to the attic slammed shut with a deafening crash. I stood frozen, gasping for air, my heart hammering. My hand reached for the door handle, but the door wouldn't open. The house was locking me in. I spun around, panic setting in as I scanned the attic. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. I felt eyes on me from every corner. The coldness seeped into my bones, and I could hear the footsteps again, louder this time, as though something was moving closer, circling me in the dark. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow, flitting just out of the light, too quick to catch clearly, but it was there, watching, waiting. I had to get out. Panic surged through me. adrenaline flooding my body as I yanked at the attic door again, but it didn't budge. The room was growing colder by the second, and the oppressive silence was slowly being replaced by the unmistakable sound of someone moving behind me. I spun around, eyes darting through the gloom. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, flickering like dark figures trying to take shape, but I couldn't make them out clearly. My breath came in short, frantic gasps, my fingers numb from the cold. I had to get out. There was no other choice. I could hear the footsteps again, slow and deliberate, as if something or someone was inching closer, circling me, drawing closer with every passing second. I wasn't imagining it. I knew I wasn't. This wasn't some overactive mind playing tricks. Then, just as I thought I might break down, my foot caught on something hidden beneath the pile of old furniture in the corner. I stumbled, nearly falling, but managed to catch myself on the wall. My hand brushed against something soft and crinkly, a piece of paper, beneath a large box that seemed oddly out of place. A journal. Its cover was worn, leather cracked and faded, but it was unmistakable. I pulled it free from the mess and flipped it open. The first page was covered in what looked like scribbled symbols, the same ones I'd seen in the attic's table and the article about Alistair Moore. There was something more, a word written at the top, smeared with ink. Asterisk, summon, asterisk. My fingers trembled as I turned the pages. The handwriting inside was shaky, erratic, almost frantic, as if the person writing it had been desperately trying to get something down before time ran out. There were drawings too, more symbols, more sketches of rituals, some of them so intricate I couldn't make sense of them. Each entry seemed more disturbed than the last. The journal was a twisted record of someone's descent into madness. Alistair Moore, I assumed, had written it, but there was more, so much more. As I flipped through the pages, a pattern emerged. He had been obsessed with opening some kind of doorway, one that led to something. He had performed rituals, tried to summon beings, entities, whatever they were. The journal grew darker, more disturbing. Moore wrote about hearing footsteps in the halls, whispers coming from the walls, and the feeling of being followed in his own home. His final entries were wild, panicked scribbles about an entity that had entered the house. He described it as watching, waiting, always hungry. The last page was smeared with something dark, maybe ink, maybe something worse, and the final words made my stomach churn. Asterisk, it's in the house now. It waits for the door to open. I can't stop it anymore. It's coming for me. Asterisk. I dropped the journal, my hands shaking. The room felt suffocating, as if the air itself was thickening, pressing in on me. The cold, the fear, the feeling of being watched, it all made sense now. Alistair Moore had opened something in this house. Something was here with me. I slammed the journal shut and pushed it aside. The air felt like it was closing in around me. The footsteps were getting louder, the presence more intense. The door to the attic rattled again, shaking on its hinges. The whisper came again, sharper this time, almost like a command. Leave. But I couldn't leave, not like this. I had to get out of this place, out of this house, but I didn't know if I could. The house itself seemed to be alive, breathing with me, pulsing in time with my panicked heartbeat. I turned back toward the door, struggling to pull it open. I threw my weight against it, desperate to escape, but it was as if something on the other side was holding it shut. The shadows seemed to close in around me, thick and impenetrable. The footsteps were no longer distant. They were right behind me. I spun, my breath hitching, and that's when I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, its outline barely visible in the darkness. It was standing at the far end of the attic, a shape just out of the light. Its eyes, or what I thought were its eyes, glowed faintly, reflecting the dim light from the hallway below. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The cold in the room intensified, and I could feel the floorboards vibrating beneath my feet as if the entire house was alive, as if it was pulsing with a strange, dark energy. I reached out, grabbing the journal again, my fingers scrambling for answers. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. A low, guttural voice echoed through the room. Too deep to be human. You shouldn't have come. It wasn't in English, but the meaning was clear. I could feel its intent. A deep hunger, a terrible rage simmering just beneath the surface. And then the door to the attic flew open. I ran. I didn't think, didn't process what was happening. I just ran. My legs moved on their own, fueled by terror, carrying me down the narrow attic stairs with no regard for anything else. The wooden steps felt like they were buckling beneath me as I crashed through the dark, my hands desperately reaching for the light switch at the end of the hallway. The moment I flicked the switch, the entire house groaned, as if waking up, as if it had been waiting for me to move. The lights flickered and buzzed, but nothing illuminated the way forward. Everything seemed darker, as if the walls were pulling the light into them. I kept running, heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps followed me, heavy, measured, deliberate. It was as though whatever was behind me wasn't in any hurry, just stalking, keeping pace, knowing I couldn't outrun it. I stumbled down the stairs, my hands gripping the banister to steady myself. When I reached the front door, I yanked on the handle. It was locked. Panic surged through me, and I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking violently. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, too close. A breath of cold air brushed my neck, and I spun around, my heart skipping a beat. The hallway was empty. I breathed in sharply, trying to calm myself, but it didn't help. My eyes darted between the door and the stairs, and I felt the weight of something cold and heavy pressing in on me. It was as if the house itself was alive, its walls closing in, pulling me back, suffocating me. Finally, I found my key, slipped it into the lock, and turned. The door creaked open, revealing the night outside. The cool air hit me like a punch to the chest, and I stepped through the door, not daring to look back. But as soon as I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that sent me stumbling forward. I twisted around, but the door was already closed, the windows locked, the house silent. I stood there in the yard, gasping for breath, shaking, my mind reeling from what had just happened. The house loomed behind me, its windows dark, silent, empty. It was over, I thought. I was out. I had escaped. But then I heard it. A sound, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing second. It was the same heavy footsteps from inside the house, slow, deliberate, unmistakable. They were following me. I turned and looked back at the house, my heart sinking. The windows, dark and empty moments before, now reflected something. A shadow, tall and thin, moving behind them. The footsteps stopped, but the figure in the window did not. I didn't wait to see more. My legs carried me forward before my brain could even process what was happening. And I ran through the yard, into the street, away from the house that I had thought was a refuge. I ran until my lungs burned, until I could no longer hear the footsteps, until the house was just a distant silhouette in the dark. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I sat there in the driver's seat, hands gripping the steering wheel, eyes locked on the road ahead. My breath was ragged, my chest heaving, but I couldn't shake the image of the house from my mind. The figure in the window, the coldness, the footsteps, the voice. The house was still there, waiting. And then I realized something. I hadn't looked at the attic before I left. I hadn't seen the journal in its place. I hadn't seen the table with the symbols. Had I even really left? Was I truly free? I couldn't answer the question. The engine of the car rumbled to life, and I drove off, not knowing where I was headed or what I was running from anymore. But one thing was certain. I could never go back to that house. Not ever again. The days that followed felt like a blur, like I was drifting in a fog I couldn't escape. I tried to carry on with my life as usual, but the haunting feeling stayed with me, deep in my bones, every waking moment. The memories of that night, of the footsteps, the voice, the figure in the attic, wouldn't leave me. They lingered like an itch I couldn't scratch, gnawing at me in the quiet moments of the day. I didn't go back to the house. I couldn't. The very thought of it made my skin crawl. But even in my safe, empty apartment, I felt as though something was still following me, something that had crossed over when I left that night. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, never fully left me. A week passed, and I tried to convince myself it was just a bad experience, a product of my imagination running wild. Old houses did strange things, but deep down I knew the truth. I hadn't imagined it. Whatever had been in that house was real, and it was waiting. I thought about contacting the authorities, but what would I say? I think there's something evil in the house I'm renting. They would laugh me off or send me to some kind of counselor. No one would believe me. It wasn't until I saw the old neighbor again that everything came rushing back. I had stopped by the corner store, my head still spinning from the lack of sleep, when I ran into Mrs. Thomas, the woman who had told me the story of the house's cursed history. She was an elderly lady, hunched over with age, her silver hair tucked under a scarf. The moment she saw me, her eyes hardened. "Been feeling the weight of it, haven't you?" she asked, her voice gravelly with age but still carrying a sense of urgency. I froze, my blood running cold. "How did you?" I began, but she cut me off with a harsh look. "You think you're the first to come through that house? You think you're the first to be pulled into it? That house has a way of keeping people." I stared at her, mouth dry, my body tense, instinctively pulling back as if she might strike me. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "The house, it was built on cursed ground. The man who lived there before you, he wasn't just obsessed with the occult. He was trying to bind something to that place, something he couldn't control. And when you walked away from it, when you thought you left it behind, it followed you." I swallowed hard, a lump forming in my throat. "How do you know?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Her eyes were dark and full of a kind of knowing that sent a shiver down my spine. "Because it always follows," she whispered. "It has no mercy." The weight of her words pressed down on me like a physical force. My stomach churned and my mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. "Do you know what happened to the others?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She nodded, her gaze distant, like she was seeing something I couldn't. "They never leave. They think they can, but it never lets them. It twists things, makes them believe they're free, but it's always watching. It won't stop until it gets what it wants." My hands were shaking, and I had to force myself to look away. "I don't understand," I said, though I felt like I did. "What does it want?" Her lips trembled, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "It wants you. It wants to take you body and soul, and it won't stop until it does." I backed away, my heart racing in my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I turned and walked quickly out of the store, the doorbell jingling behind me as I rushed outside. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with this information, but I knew one thing for certain. I had to go back to the house. It wasn't rational, I knew that. I shouldn't go back. Every part of me screamed that it was a terrible idea, but something inside me, the same compulsion I had felt the night I first stepped into the house, pulled me back. The idea of leaving things unfinished, of never knowing what was truly in that house, gnawed at me. I couldn't just walk away not knowing. So, as the sun began to set, I drove back to that old, cursed house. The drive to the house was long, silent, and filled with an unbearable tension. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. I didn't know what I expected to find when I got there. Answers, a confrontation, or just a confirmation that the house was as cursed as Mrs. Thomas had said. But the closer I got, the heavier the air around me seemed to become. The night sky above had turned an unnatural shade of gray, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows across the road. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. When I pulled up in front of the house, it was just as I remembered it. silent, dark looming. The porch light flickered faintly, casting an eerie glow over the cracked steps. The house looked abandoned, as if time had forgotten it. But it wasn't empty. It was never empty. The door was unlocked when I tried it. I barely registered it before stepping inside. But the moment I crossed the threshold, a cold, suffocating wave of dread washed over me. The feeling that had consumed me on my first night back here came rushing back. I took a hesitant step inside, hearing the familiar creak of the floorboards underfoot. The house groaned, the sound echoing through the empty hall like a warning. The air was thick, like it was holding something back, keeping something just out of sight. The walls seemed to close in around me as I walked deeper into the house. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't just the shadows. No, there was something in the house, something that had been waiting for me. I moved cautiously toward the stairs. I didn't want to go up there again. I didn't want to face whatever was in the attic, but something inside me, some instinct or compulsion, drove me forward. I could hear faint whispers now, soft but unmistakable, coming from upstairs. They weren't clear enough to make out the words, but they were there. It was as if the house was calling me. I ascended the stairs slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. Every step I took was met with a soft, hollow creak, the sound echoing through the stillness of a house. When I reached the top, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, but I couldn't make out the words. Then I saw it, the door to the attic, slightly ajar. I froze, unable to move, my breath shallow. Someone was in there. With a trembling hand, I reached for the door. It opened with a groan, revealing the attic beyond, darker than I remembered, the shadows seeming to stretch and shift. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. And then I heard it, a voice, low, guttural, and full of malice. It was coming from the far corner of the attic. Come closer. I didn't have to see the figure to know it was there. The feeling of it, its presence, was enough to paralyze me. It was like the room itself was alive, like the walls were pressing in, urging me forward. But I couldn't. I didn't want to know what waited in that dark corner. I couldn't face it. And yet, I found myself stepping forward, my body moving without my consent. The floorboards groaned under my weight, the air colder with every step. I could feel the presence in the corner, something watching me from the dark. The whispers were growing louder, more frantic. I was nearly there. The floor suddenly shifted beneath me, and I stumbled. A loud thud echoed through the attic, and then everything fell silent. I froze, standing in the dark listening. My breath was ragged, my body trembling with fear. And then I heard it again, the footsteps. They were behind me, not just one set, but two, or maybe more. The sound was growing louder, closer, surrounding me. I turned quickly, expecting to see something, anything, but the attic was still empty, except it wasn't. From the darkness, two glowing eyes appeared, watching me with a terrible intensity. The figure was tall, too tall, its form flickering in and out of the shadows, like it was somehow both there and not there. Its face was obscured, but the eyes, they were real, and they were coming for me. Before I could react, a cold wind slammed into me, pushing me back. I stumbled, my heart racing in my chest, and then I saw it, a flash of something, a blur, like a shape moving toward me, faster than I could react. It was the door to the attic, the door I had entered through. It slammed shut, trapping me inside. I pounded on it, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. The cold wind swirled around me, the whispers louder now, filling the air with a maddening noise. And then I heard it, clear as day, the voice, but this time it was right behind me. You shouldn't have come back. The cold pressed in, squeezing the breath from my lungs. The air was thick, suffocating. My vision blurred, and I felt myself being pulled toward the center of the room, unable to stop it. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I had made a terrible mistake coming back. I gasped for air, but none seemed to reach my lungs. The room was closing in, suffocating me, the air thick with a biting cold that gnawed at my skin. My heart pounded in my chest, but it was as if the fear wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to the house, to the thing in the corner, to whatever had been waiting for me to return. The whispers grew louder, no longer just distant murmurs but voices, hundreds of them, all overlapping, blending together into an incoherent jumble of sound. My head throbbed with the pressure, and my stomach churned violently, as though something inside me was trying to claw its way out. The glowing eyes, those cold, unblinking eyes, were moving closer now. The figure they belonged to still shrouded in shadow. I couldn't make out its shape, but I could feel it. I could feel the weight of it, the oppressive darkness that filled every corner of the attic. I tried to move, tried to escape, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Every step I tried to take was met with resistance, as though the house itself was pulling me back, holding me in place. And then the voice. "You shouldn't have come back," it said again, this time clear and commanding, deep and echoing like a growl from the very bowels of the earth. I turned, frantically searching for a way out, but the walls had shifted. The hallway behind me now a solid mass of darkness, like it had disappeared entirely. There was no way out. I was trapped. "Leave this place." The voice commanded, a dark, twisted force behind the words. I didn't know how, but I knew the voice was coming from the thing, the figure in the corner. I couldn't see it fully, but I felt its presence as if it were suffocating me, wrapping around my body like cold, rotting vines. I wanted to scream, to beg for help, but my voice caught in my throat, silenced by the pressure of the air around me. The thing, whatever it was moving now, slowly, deliberately, as if it had all the time in the world. But I had no time left. The shadows around me seemed to stretch out, reaching for me, pulling me toward the center of the room. My body was forced to follow, my legs moving against my will. I could feel the coldness of the floor beneath me, like ice, biting into my skin with each step. And then I saw it, something moving in the dark, something large, something that shouldn't have been there. A shape, a silhouette, shifting as if it were not entirely real. My heart stopped in my chest. From the corner, the figure came forward, the glowing eyes growing brighter with every step, its form taking shape, becoming clearer. I could see it now, tall, impossibly tall, with a long, slender body that seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally. Its face was nothing more than a void, an empty space where features should have been. But those eyes were real, cold, burning with a hatred I couldn't comprehend. It reached out, its long, bony fingers stretching toward me. "Stay," it whispered, the word cold and heavy, and I felt its power, its grip, pulling me closer. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I had made a mistake. I had come back. And now, there was no escape. The figure loomed before me, its shadow stretching across the attic like a blanket of darkness. Its hands, long and gnarled, reached out with terrifying slowness. Each movement felt deliberate, as if savoring my fear, feeding off it. My body was frozen, as though the air around me had turned to stone, making it impossible to flee. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to whisper, the words barely leaving my lips. The thing didn't answer immediately. Instead, it stared at me with those unblinking, otherworldly eyes, its gaze piercing through me, stripping me of everything I was. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating, like it existed outside of time and space. It wasn't just here with me. It was everywhere. "You think you can walk away," it rasped, its voice low and rasping, like gravel scraping against metal. "But you are already ours." I shook my head, trying to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. The floor seemed to suck me in, the cold seeping through the soles of my shoes, anchoring me in place. I felt my skin tighten, my muscles straining, but I couldn't escape the pull of its voice, the command behind its every word. "You were never meant to leave," the thing continued, its voice becoming a low growl. "You opened the door. Now it's ours to close." I didn't understand. The words, the meaning, they made no sense. I hadn't opened anything. I hadn't done anything. But then a memory resurfaced, a journal, a diary, buried under dust in the attic. The rituals, the symbols, the strange markings on the floor, the house, the curse. It wasn't just haunted. It was bound by something old, something powerful. "You came searching for answers," it said, its form slowly undulating, like the very air was bending around it. But some things should remain unknown. The shadow flickered, and in that moment I realized this wasn't just a haunting. It was a prison, a gate, a doorway between worlds. And somehow I had crossed it. I remembered Mrs. Thomas's words. Asterisk, it wants you. It wants to take you body and soul. And it won't stop until it does. Asterisk. I wanted to scream, but the sound was caught in my throat. A wave of nausea hit me, and the room began to spin. The walls of the attic seemed to warp, bending inward, as though the house itself were breathing, alive, pulsating with dark energy. The figure reached out, its fingers long and twisted, curling like claws. I felt an icy chill as it brushed against my skin, sending a wave of cold so deep it felt like it was freezing my very soul. "You are the sacrifice," it whispered, its voice now right behind me, too close. "The price for your curiosity." Suddenly, I was no longer alone. The air around me thickened, and I could feel it. Asterisk them star. The presence of others, more than one, shifting in the darkness of the attic. I couldn't see them, but I could feel their cold, malevolent energy surrounding me, pressing in on me, suffocating me. "You aren't the first," the figure continued, its voice echoing around the room. "We have claimed many before you, but you are the one who opened the door." The whispers grew louder, frantic, as if they were all speaking at once. I felt my mind start to unravel, the weight of their words crushing me. The house wasn't just cursed. It was a trap. It had been built to draw people in, to claim them, to drag them into the darkness. The figure's grip tightened on my arm, and I screamed, struggling against its pull. But it was no use. I felt my strength draining away, my will faltering. "Why me?" I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The figure leaned in closer, its cold breath brushing my face. Its voice dropped to a whisper, sending a shiver down my spine. "You have already given us what we need." Before I could react, the room exploded into darkness, a rush of cold air sweeping through me. I felt myself falling, my body weightless, as if the very ground had been ripped out from beneath me. And then, nothing. I woke up with a start, gasping for air as if I had been underwater. My chest heaved, struggling to take in breath, my limbs heavy with an unnatural weight. The darkness around me was suffocating, but somehow it felt different. Not just dark, but wrong. It wasn't the usual quiet of an attic, the creaks of an old house. It was as if the space itself had been warped, twisted, and everything within it felt displaced. I blinked several times, trying to adjust to the shadows, but it was useless. No matter how much I tried to focus, I couldn't see anything clearly. I tried to stand, but my body didn't obey. My legs were stiff, trembling, as if I had been frozen in place for hours, days, maybe. My skin tingled with the sensation of something crawling underneath it. My heart thudded, an erratic pulse that echoed in my ears. Where was I? The last thing I remembered was a figure, the thing in the corner. I had been dragged toward it. The air had gone cold, and then nothing. I forced myself to push up onto my hands and knees, the floor beneath me hard and unyielding. The room around me felt wrong, too quiet, too still. It was then I realized I wasn't in the attic anymore. My breath caught in my throat as panic began to set in. I was no longer surrounded by the familiar, old wooden beams of the house. I was in a space that was far more unsettling. The walls were smooth, unnatural. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive presence. It was as if the very foundation of reality had cracked and let something seep through. I tried to push myself to my feet again, this time with more urgency. My fingers grazed the surface beneath me, something cool and slick. My palms felt the texture, smooth like glass or polished stone. I lifted my hand, my fingertips trembling as I brought them to my face. When I looked, my fingers were stained in a strange, dark substance. Blood? No, it didn't feel right. It wasn't blood. The thought barely settled in my mind before I felt something move in the shadows around me. A whisper, soft but unmistakable. Asterisk, we are not done, asterisk. The voice was the same, and yet it wasn't. It sounded more alive, more real. A deep, guttural rasp that seemed to seep through the air and settle into the very fabric of the room. The walls seemed to pulsate with the rhythm of its words. I stumbled backward, my body still weak and disoriented. I couldn't see anything in the endless black around me, but I knew I wasn't alone. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come back. Asterisk, it repeated. Only now it wasn't just a figure from the attic. There were others, dozens of them, maybe more, each voice layering over the others until it felt like I was drowning in sound. I tried to speak, tried to ask where I was, but my throat was dry, as if the very air had stolen my voice. The shadows around me seemed to come alive, swirling in erratic patterns, twisting like they were made of liquid darkness. And then, slowly, shapes began to form. The first thing I saw was a pair of eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness. Then another and another. They blinked, unblinking eyes, fixed on me with a terrifying stillness. Something moved toward me. A shape, a silhouette. Asterisk, the price of curiosity is always high. Asterisk, the voice said again, louder this time, booming, shaking the ground beneath me. I didn't have the strength to fight it anymore. I collapsed to my knees, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The darkness pressed in closer, suffocating, filling every corner, every inch of space with its heavy, invasive presence. I thought I saw a figure step into view, tall, familiar. It was him again, the figure from the attic, the one with the glowing eyes, the one that had pulled me into this hell. His face was still a void, but those eyes, they were burning brighter, and I could feel them searing through me, as if they could read every thought, every fear. Asterisk, you have crossed the threshold, asterisk, he whispered, his voice reverberating around the room. Asterisk, you are bound to us now, asterisk. The last of my strength drained away, and I fell forward, my forehead pressing against the cold surface beneath me. It wasn't the stone I had thought it to be. It was something far worse. Flesh, something otherworldly, stretching, pulsating with life. And it was alive. And then I saw it, just for a moment, a flash of light. The house I had left behind. I felt a wave of recognition, a tug at the core of my being. The door, the attic, the place I had once walked away from. But it wasn't over. Not yet. In the moment I realized the truth, that I had never left, that I was still there. The floor beneath me gave way. I fell, and I kept falling. I fell for what felt like an eternity. The air around me was thick, heavy with the pressure of 1,000 whispers, all vying for my attention, pulling me deeper into the void. My body felt weightless, but I could still sense the twisting, contorting sensation as if I was being pulled apart, thread by thread, piece by piece. I don't know how long I fell, but time no longer seemed to exist. It felt like I was drifting in some otherworldly place, a space between realms where nothing was real and everything was suffocatingly, maddeningly real all at once. The voices, the shapes, the eyes, they were all around me, watching, waiting. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I hit something. Hard. The sudden impact left me gasping for air. My hand scrambled against a solid surface, cold, slick, almost alive, and I pushed myself up, blinking rapidly as my mind tried to make sense of the darkness that surrounded me. The air was damp, foul, and stifling. The smell of decay filled my nostrils, mixing with the pungent, rotting scent of old earth. I wasn't sure if I was still in the attic or even still in the house. The ground beneath me didn't feel like wood or stone. It felt soft, like the ground in a graveyard, the soil that had been disturbed by centuries of forgotten hands. And then I saw it, a door. It stood before me, a faded wooden frame, ancient and covered in grime, its surface worn by time. The handle, blackened and rusted, gleamed in the dim, flickering light that seemed to come from nowhere. The door was unlike any I had seen before, too plain, too simple for a house that had once been so filled with grandeur. It seemed out of place in the madness that surrounded it. I felt a pull, an almost magnetic force, drawing me toward it. My body moved on its own accord, every muscle straining to resist the force that urged me to approach, but I couldn't fight it. I stepped closer, my hands shaking as I reached for the doorknob. As my fingers brushed the cold metal, a surge of energy coursed through my body. It was like an electric shock, but more than that. It was something else, something ancient, something that seemed to ripple through the very fabric of existence itself. I could feel the house, no, whatever this place was, shifting around me, responding to my touch. A sound echoed through the space, distant yet close, soft at first, like a low hum, and then it grew louder, a whisper, followed by another, then more, until the voices were deafening, each one louder than the last. Asterisk come in asterisk, they hissed. Asterisk, it's time, asterisk. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. I stepped through, and the world around me seemed to unravel. The darkness that had once surrounded me was now replaced by blinding light, too bright, too pure. I shielded my eyes, but it was no use. The light consumed everything, and then the voices stopped. The air around me grew still. The darkness, the strange, oppressive presence, had been replaced by an eerie calm. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe without the suffocating weight pressing down on me. I opened my eyes, expecting to see something, anything, but instead, I found myself standing in the middle of the room. The room was familiar, and yet not. It was a house, but it was wrong. The walls were warped, stretched like the skin of some great beast, pulsating as if alive. The floor beneath my feet was slick, covered in a black, viscous liquid that seeped up around my ankles. But there was no one here. No figure. No presence. Just silence. And then I heard it. A faint, slow click. I turned quickly, my heart racing in my chest, and there, in the far corner of the room, was a door. The same door. But this time, it wasn't just an exit. It was the entrance. Something inside me recoiled, the terror gripping me with unrelenting force. This wasn't over. It was never over. Whatever had started in that house, whatever had been unleashed, wasn't finished. The door had closed, but now it had opened again. Asterisk waiting star. I ran toward it, my feet slipping in the black substance on the floor. The door was still there, standing tall, but it was different now. It was pulsing, as if alive, each beat matching the frantic rhythm of my heart. The voices were back, louder now, swirling around me, calling me toward the door. I could feel them again, the eyes, watching me, waiting, hungry, and then, without warning, the door slammed shut. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I was not alone. The darkness in the room deepened, swirling around me until it became solid. I couldn't see, couldn't move. My vision was blurred, my body frozen in place, as if time itself had stopped. And then I heard it, clear as day. You're not leaving. The voices filled the space, echoing in my mind, in my very soul. The air turned cold again, and I could feel something pulling at me, dragging me back. The walls of the room closed in, the darkness closing around me as the whispers grew louder, more frantic, more desperate. The door had closed, but the house was still here. It was still watching, waiting, and now I knew the truth. Whatever had begun when I moved into that house was far from over. It would never be over. It had never let me leave. Story 2. The day I pulled into the driveway of my new rental house. I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief because, after months of sorting through the wreckage of my divorce, I'd finally found a place to call my own. Apprehension because, well, the house wasn't exactly what I'd imagined. It stood at the edge of town, a tall, narrow structure with peeling paint and sagging gutters. The windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned in decades, their glass panes dull and streaked. But the rent was cheap, and it was all I could afford after the legal fees had drained my savings. I stepped out of my car and stretched, breathing in the crisp autumn air. The neighborhood was quiet, a few scattered houses lining the street. Beyond them, the woods stretched out like an endless sea of gold and crimson leaves. I shivered, though not from the cold. The landlord, Mr. Hensley, had left the key under the mat as promised. I found it easily and let myself in. The door creaked loudly as it swung open, and the smell hit me immediately, a musty, earthy scent, like damp wood and old books. The interior was quaint, to put it kindly. Hardwood floors that groaned underfoot, wallpaper curling at the edges, and a fireplace in the living room that looked like it hadn't been used in years. It was far from perfect, but it was mine. After unloading the car, I spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking. By evening, I'd managed to set up my bed, a small dining table, and a couple of chairs. As I settled in with a frozen dinner, I heard the first of the house's quirks, a faint creaking noise coming from upstairs. I froze, fork halfway to my mouth, and listened. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the second floor. "It's just the house settling," I muttered to myself, forcing a laugh. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The same creaking, the same measured pace. It moved from one end of the upstairs hallway to the other, then stopped. I told myself it was nothing. Old houses made noise, didn't they? I woke up the next morning feeling groggy, the events of the night before weighing heavily on my mind. The footsteps had stopped eventually, but only after what felt like hours of lying in bed, clutching the blanket like a shield. By the time sunlight streamed through the cracked blinds, I had almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Stress, exhaustion, the creaks of an old house, it all added up. The day passed uneventfully. I focused on settling in, scrubbing down the kitchen counters, organizing my books on the rickety shelves, and avoiding any lingering thoughts about the previous night. It wasn't until the late afternoon that I met one of my neighbors. I was out back, tossing some dead leaves into a bag, when a voice called out behind me, "Hey there, new to the neighborhood?" I turned to see a man leaning over the fence. He was in his 60s, with thinning gray hair and a friendly, weathered face. "Yeah, just moved in yesterday," I said, brushing my hands on my jeans. "I'm Aaron, by the way." "Tom," he replied with a nod. "You're in old Whitaker's place, huh?" The name didn't mean anything to me, but the way he said it made me pause. There was something in his tone, hesitation maybe. "Guess so," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Do you know much about it?" Tom shrugged, his gaze shifting to the house. "Not a lot. Just stories, you know? Place has been empty for a while. People move in, don't stay long. Always some excuse. Job transfer. Didn't like the layout, whatever." I frowned. "Why's that?" Well, he scratched the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "There are rumors. Strange noises, weird stuff happening. People say the house has a history." "History?" "Yeah, something about the guy who built it. Old man Whitaker. He was into, let's just say, unusual things. Occult stuff, Rituals. That kind of thing. Some folks think he brought something into the house that shouldn't be there. I laughed nervously. And you believe that? Tom gave me a long, measured look. I don't know what I believe, but I know what I've heard. Just keep your eyes open. And if you hear something at night, maybe it's better not to go looking for it. He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. That night, the creaking started again. It was louder this time, more distinct. I lay in bed, heart pounding, as the footsteps moved back and forth across the hallway above me. Then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. The silence was worse. It pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. My ears strained for any sound, any indication of movement. And then I heard it, a whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A soft, raspy voice, speaking words I couldn't understand. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. It's just the wind, I told myself, though I didn't believe it. But the whisper came again, closer this time, and I could swear it was coming from inside the walls. The whispering persisted that night, growing louder with each passing hour. I lay in bed, rigid and wide-eyed, listening intently. It was as if something, or someone, was just beyond the thin walls, murmuring in a language that didn't belong in this world. Eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep, only to wake up at the crack of dawn, the words still echoing in my mind. I had to do something. The following morning, I went to the local library. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Anything that might shed light on the house's history, on the strange rumors Tom had mentioned. The library itself was small, tucked between a diner and a dusty hardware store. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and wood polish. A woman at the front desk greeted me with a polite nod as I approached. "Can I help you find something?" she asked. "I'm looking for information about the Whitaker house," I said, trying to sound casual. "Anything about its past, maybe the original owner, or if anything strange has happened there." Her eyebrows shot up at the mention of the Whitaker house. "Oh, that one. You're brave," she said with a small, amused smile. I felt a chill at her words. "Why's that?" She hesitated, then stood up and walked toward a back shelf, pulling out an old leather-bound journal. It looked ancient, its spine cracked and worn. She placed it gently on the counter. This belonged to a man named Charles Whitaker, the last of the family to live there. He passed away decades ago. I've had it tucked away for years, but, well, it's better in your hands now. I stared at the journal, the weight of it sending a shiver down my spine. "What's in it?" "His personal writings," she said softly. "Rituals, beliefs, things he believed would protect him. From what, I don't know, but I'd be careful. If I were you, I didn't need any more encouragement." I thanked her, took the journal, and hurried back to the house. That night, as I sat on the worn-out couch, the journal open in my lap, I began reading. Charles Whitaker's handwriting was erratic, frantic at times. He wrote about strange occurrences, things that seemed impossible, objects moving on their own, shadows in the corners of his vision, a feeling of being watched. The more I read, the clearer it became. Whitaker had been obsessed with the supernatural. He believed the house was a doorway to something far darker than anyone could comprehend. One entry caught my eye, dated just a week before he died. Asterisk, the ritual must be completed. It is the only way to close the door. If it is not sealed, the house will claim me, just as it has claimed the others. I can feel them watching, waiting. There is no time left, asterisk. I turned the page, my hands trembling. The next entry was even more chilling. Asterisk, I can hear it now. The whispers. They come from the walls, from beneath the floorboards. I tried to banish them, but it only made things worse. I've invited them in. There is no escape now. They will get me, asterisk. A cold shiver ran through me as I closed the journal, my mind racing. What had Whitaker done here? What had he unleashed? The house was no longer just an old, creaky place. It was something else, a prison, a gateway, a vessel for whatever dark force had taken hold of Charles Whitaker. I looked around the room, the familiar creaks of the floorboards suddenly unnerving. The shadows seemed to shift on their own, as if they were watching me. Then, I heard it again, the whisper. It was louder this time, clearer. Aaron, my name. It was unmistakable. I jumped to my feet, heart racing, my breath caught in my throat. The whisper was coming from behind me, from the hallway just outside the living room. I hesitated, dread pooling in my stomach. Should I investigate, or should I leave, like Tom had warned? The whisper came again, this time with a sharp, guttural tone. Come closer. I swallowed hard and, against every instinct screaming in my head, stepped toward the door. I stood frozen at the door, my hand resting on the knob, heart pounding in my chest. The whisper had stopped, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. But the feeling of someone was right there, just beyond the door. It felt like I wasn't alone, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. For a moment, I hesitated. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to turn around, to lock the door and never come back out. But then, there was that part of me, the part that had driven me to read Whitaker's journal, the part that wanted answers, that took over. I turned the knob and slowly opened the door, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness. The hallway beyond was dark, lit only by the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the cracks in the curtains. I could hear nothing but the sound of my own breathing, sharp and ragged in the silence. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling as I stepped forward. The floorboards creaked underfoot, as if the house itself were groaning in response. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever. Each step I took amplifying the feeling that I was being watched. I reached the top of the stairs, my eyes darting back and forth, scanning the darkness. And then I saw it, a shadow. It was a figure, tall and thin, standing at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the light. It was still unmoving, as though it was waiting for me. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The shadow wasn't human. It wasn't like any shape I'd ever seen before. It was wrong. My legs were shaking now, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away from the shadow. It seemed to grow larger the longer I stared at it, as if it were stretching out toward me, reaching for me. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the hallway, carrying with it a faint, foul smell, something rancid and decaying. The air seemed to grow thick, suffocating, as though the house itself were closing in on me. Then, the whisper came again. "Come closer." The words felt like ice in my veins, and without thinking, I backed away. My feet scrambled to find purchase on the slick wood floor as I turned and ran back toward the living room. I slammed the door behind me, my heart pounding so loudly it felt like it might burst from my chest. For a moment, all I could do was stand there, gasping for breath, my eyes wide with terror. But as the adrenaline began to subside, a thought started to creep into my mind. What if I hadn't seen a shadow? What if it had been something worse? I could still feel it, that oppressive weight, that presence in the house, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I had to get out of there. I rushed to the front door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. But when I pulled the door open, nothing. There was no one outside, no escape. I stepped back, confusion and panic rising in my chest. I didn't understand. Why was the door still locked? Why couldn't I leave? Then I heard it again, a soft, rhythmic thudding sound coming from upstairs. The footsteps. They were back, louder now, deliberate and unyielding. I spun around, the feeling of being trapped becoming unbearable. There was no escape. The house wouldn't let me go. I had to know what was happening. I had to find out what Whitaker had done, what he had unleashed in this place. The footsteps from upstairs grew louder, closer. I could hear them now, echoing down the stairs, heavy and deliberate, as if something, was making its way toward me. My heart was in my throat, each beat too loud in my ears. I had no choice but to face whatever this was. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and grabbed the journal again. My hands were slick with sweat as I flipped through its pages, searching for any clue, any hint about what I needed to do to stop this. The house groaned around me, like a beast stirring from slumber, and the cold breeze swept through the room again, carrying the stench of rot. But I didn't care. I had to focus. Then, a note in Whitaker's journal caught my eye. It was scrawled hastily, as though the writer had been in a hurry, or perhaps in a panic. Asterisk, the ritual must be completed tonight. If I fail, the door will open wide and all will be lost. There is only one way to close it, through blood, through sacrifice. But I fear that even then, it may not be enough. The house is hungry, asterisk. The words seem to burn into my mind, their meaning sinking deep into my bones. Sacrifice? Blood? What had Whitaker been doing in this house? What had he been trying to stop? Or perhaps, what had he unleashed? I slammed the journal shut and bolted toward the stairs, my legs moving without thinking. The footsteps above me continued, as if encouraging me to follow. As I reached the top of the stairs, the air grew colder still, and the hallway stretched out before me like a tunnel, dark and suffocating. The shadows seemed to shift and twitch at the edges of my vision, as if something was moving within them. I stepped forward, the floorboards creaking under my weight. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I could feel my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. At the end of the hallway, I saw it. The door to what I assumed had been Whitaker's study. It was ajar, just a crack, and from within, I could hear a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. I reached out, my hand trembling as I pushed the door open. The room inside was small and cramped, filled with bookshelves crammed full of ancient texts, papers scattered across the floor, and strange symbols drawn on the walls. The walls themselves seemed to be pulsing with a sickly light, like something was alive within them. And there, in the middle of the room, was a large blackened circle, drawn on the floor in what I now realized was blood. The smell of it hit me like a physical blow, thick and nauseating. I stepped forward, the air growing colder with each step. The tapping sound was louder now, closer. I could see that it was coming from the far corner of the room. There, in the shadows, I saw him. Charles Whitaker. His body was hunched over, his back arched unnaturally, his hands twitching as though they were still caught in the throes of some unholy ritual. His eyes were wide open, unblinking, staring straight ahead, but there was no life in them, no humanity. And then I realized he wasn't alone. Figures were standing around him, shadowy and indistinct, their forms barely visible in the darkness. I could feel their eyes on me, cold and unfeeling, as they slowly turned their heads in unison. I stepped back, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my skin crawling with the sensation of hundreds of eyes on me. And then a voice, a deep, guttural whisper, spoke from the shadows. You shouldn't have come. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing in from all sides. The figures in the shadows began to move, their footsteps echoing in time with my racing heart. I turned and fled, running down the hallway, back toward the stairs. The floor beneath me trembled as though the house itself were alive, its very foundation shaking with anger. The whispering started again, louder now. A cacophony of voices, all speaking in that same guttural language, the words meaningless but filled with terror. I stumbled, nearly falling as I reached the top of the stairs and looked down into the darkness below. There was something in the shadows, something watching me. I heard the heavy footsteps again, closer, closer, faster. The presence was almost on me. I didn't wait. I ran blind, down the stairs and toward the front door. The whispers followed me, the shadows moving with me, as if they were chasing me, taunting me. I burst through the door and into the night air, gasping for breath. My legs shook, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I looked back at the house. It stood there, silent now, as if nothing had happened, as if it had been waiting for me to leave. I turned and ran into the darkness of the woods, not stopping until I couldn't hear the whispers anymore. But even as I ran, I knew whatever was in that house, whatever Charles Whitaker had unleashed, it wasn't done with me. The weeks that followed were a blur of confusion and fear. I didn't speak to anyone about what had happened. How could I? Who would believe me? The town had its rumors about the Whitaker house, but nothing could explain what I had seen, what I had felt. I didn't stay in the area for long after that night. I packed my things quickly, as though if I lingered too long, something might come after me. I found a small apartment in the city, far from the haunting presence of the house. I thought I had escaped, but the dreams came every night. At first, they were just fleeting images, a shadow passing by my window, a whispering voice just out of reach. But then the dreams grew stronger, more vivid. The house, that same decaying house, loomed in the distance, its windows dark and watching, its door ajar, beckoning me inside. Every night, I would wake up gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, heart racing. It wasn't just the house that haunted me. It was the things inside it. I tried everything, therapy, medication, even moving to a different city. But no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, the dreams followed. And then one day, I received a letter. The envelope was old, yellowed with age, and the handwriting on the front was shaky, barely legible. Aaron, you have been chosen. It is not over. Come back to the house. The door is open. There was no return address, no signature, just those few haunting words. I didn't know what sent it, but I knew what it meant. The house had called me back. It wasn't finished with me. For days, I couldn't get the letter out of my mind. The idea of returning, of facing whatever haunted that place, terrified me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that there was something I had left behind, something unfinished, something that I couldn't escape. I had to go back. That night, I drove back to the town, the road stretching out before me in the dark. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, as I made my way to the old house. The letter had pulled me back, but I didn't know what awaited me there. When I arrived, the house stood as it always had, silent, unmoving, its dark windows like eyes watching my every move. The door was slightly open, as if waiting for me to come in. I stepped out of the car, my breath visible in the cold night air. The wind howled through the trees, and I could hear the faintest echo of footsteps, distant but unmistakable. I approached the house slowly, my feet heavy as I moved closer. The ground beneath me seemed to pulse, as though the earth itself was alive. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The air was thick with the same musty smell from before, but now there was something else, an acrid scent like burning wood, mixed with the faintest trace of decay. I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps loud in the silence. The house seemed unchanged, frozen in time, as though nothing had happened. But I could feel it. The house was alive in a way it hadn't been before. The walls were pulsing with energy, and the shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting in ways they shouldn't. I found myself drawn back to the stairs, the same stairs I had fled from so many weeks ago. The whispering returned, faint at first, but growing louder as I climbed. Come closer. The voice was like a physical weight, pressing down on me, wrapping around me like a rope. I reached the top of the stairs, and there it was again, the door to Whitaker's study. It was wide open now, the shadows inside deep and suffocating. And then I saw it. A figure stood in the center of the room, back to me, its form twisted and unnatural. The shadows around it seemed to bend and distort, wrapping around it like tendrils. I froze, my body shaking. It wasn't Whitaker. It was something else, something far worse. The figure turned slowly, and for the briefest of moments, I thought I saw its face. But it wasn't human. There were no eyes, no nose, just a smooth, blank surface, like it had never been fully formed. I felt a scream rise in my throat, but no sound came out. The thing in front of me stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural. "You cannot leave." The voice was inside my head, inside my very soul, and I felt my knees buckle beneath me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the presence, the weight of whatever it was that had taken hold of this house. And then the shadows surged forward, wrapping around me like a dark tide, pulling me into the center of the room. I was swallowed whole by the shadows. They curled around me like tendrils, pulling me deeper into the darkness of the room. The world outside of that dark space ceased to exist. My senses were drowning in the overwhelming feeling of cold and fear. I couldn't move, couldn't even scream, just trapped in a void where only the whispers remained, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. "You cannot leave." The voice rang through my mind again, louder now, the words vibrating in the air around me. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a command. The figure, if that's what it was, moved toward me, its shape shifting and distorting with every step it took. The shadows seemed to twist and warp in response to its presence, and I could feel them pressing in on me, crushing me from all sides. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was frozen, rooted to the spot, unable to escape the oncoming darkness. My eyes locked onto the figure in front of me, and I felt something cold and ancient stir deep within the room. "You are not the first." The voice wasn't just in my head anymore. It came from all around me, from the very walls of the house. It felt like the house itself was speaking to me, its presence swallowing everything. I wanted to turn and run, but my body refused to move. I was pinned by an invisible force, held in place by something far more powerful than fear alone. The figure drew closer, and now I could hear the sound of its feet dragging across the floor, like something scraping against stone. It was getting closer. My breath was shallow, my chest tight. I couldn't make sense of what was happening. How had it come to this? What was this thing? "I was here long before you." The words dripped with a malevolent satisfaction. The thing reached out toward me, its hand, a twisted, elongated version of a human hand, outstretched and skeletal. I could see the fingers now, unnaturally long. The skin stretched in over them, blackened and decayed. I could feel the cold radiating from it. It wasn't just cold. It was ancient, a deep, chilling cold that reached into the marrow of my bones. The shadowy hand hovered just inches from my face. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but I couldn't. The figure's face remained featureless, but I could feel its gaze. It was as if its very presence bore down on me, crushing me beneath the weight of its existence. The shadows that surrounded me seemed to press even closer, a suffocating blanket that left me gasping for air. I have seen many come and go. The voice again, louder now, as if the very walls of the house were speaking. The room around me seemed to distort. The walls blurred in and out of focus. The shadows were moving, crawling, shifting, and I felt myself slipping, like I was losing my grip on reality. And then, in a horrifying instant, I realized this thing wasn't just from the house. It was the house. It was the embodiment of everything that had been twisted, broken, and buried within those walls. Every tragedy, every lost soul, every dark ritual. It had all coalesced into this thing, this force. It was the house itself. You are a part of it now. The shadows around me thickened, and I could hear faint voices within them. Too many to count, all speaking in unison, whispering in that same guttural language. It was a cacophony, a symphony of suffering. I felt my chest constrict, my heart slammed painfully against my ribs, each beat harder than the last. I felt the room closing in on me, the walls pressing tighter. I was being suffocated. "No one leaves." The figure raised its hand toward me, and for the first time, I saw its face, a face that wasn't a face at all. It was smooth, blank, featureless, like a mask of some forgotten god, devoid of eyes or expression. But the more I looked, the more I saw it. Not just the shape of the mask, but the horror it contained. I was staring into the very heart of the house's curse, into the darkness that had always been here, waiting for someone like me to stumble in and feed it. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of its presence pressing down on me like a vice. The whispering grew louder, the voices suffocating me, drowning out all thought, all reason. I knew then that I was never meant to leave. The last thing I heard before everything went black was that voice, whispering in my ear, as though it were the house itself, claiming me. You are mine now. When I woke up, it was as if no time had passed. The darkness was absolute, suffocating, and the air was thick with the unmistakable scent of decay. For a moment, I wasn't sure where I was. My senses had betrayed me, leaving me lost in the crushing weight of the blackness around me. I couldn't move. My body felt like it was made of stone, each part of me frozen in place, as though the very act of breathing would tear me apart. My heart thudded in my chest, a rhythmic reminder that I was still alive, still trapped. And then a low sound, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder by the second. It was a scraping, a dragging, like something being dragged across the floor. I could hear it coming from every direction at once. I tried to open my eyes, but it was as if the darkness itself was too thick to see through. There were no shapes, no outlines, just the crushing, endless black. You are still here. The voice, deep and guttural, wrapped around me, chilling my blood. It wasn't just a whisper now. It was an overwhelming presence in my mind, a sensation that drowned out all other thoughts. The voice wasn't speaking to me. It was speaking for me. You will never leave. The air grew colder, the darkness more oppressive. I could feel the walls around me now, the rough stone of the house pressing against me from all sides, as though I were enclosed in a tomb. I was suffocating, unable to breathe, and yet, somehow, I couldn't die. I tried to scream, but my mouth wouldn't open. The air was thick, as if the house had wrapped itself around me like a shroud. I could feel its weight bearing down on me, pressing into me, and I realized, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that the house wasn't just holding me here. It had absorbed me, taken me in, and now it was part of me. You are mine. The voice was clearer now, sharper. It came not just from the walls, not just from the darkness, but from within me. It echoed in my skull, reverberated in my bones, in my blood. The house had claimed me, had twisted me into one of its own. I wasn't alone anymore. The shadows around me began to shift, moving in ways they shouldn't. They morphed into shapes, dark, shifting figures that seemed to take form and then vanish again. They whispered in a language I couldn't understand, their voices melding together into a terrifying symphony. They are all here. The shadows shifted again, and this time I saw them. Faces, or rather, what had once been faces. Hollow, eyeless sockets, mouths stretched wide in eternal screams. Each one a ghost of those who had come before me, the previous tenants, the ones who had been swallowed by this house. They reached for me, their skeletal hands outstretched, fingers twisted in unnatural angles. Their voices wailed and pleaded, but the sound was so distorted, so wrong. It was almost as if they were trying to tell me something. But it was too late. You are part of us now. The cold pressed in again, colder than anything I had ever felt before, deeper than any winter night. My skin tingled as if frozen from the inside out, and I felt my body begin to stiffen, as though it were losing its humanity. The house was feeding on me, turning me into one of its own, transforming me into something that no longer resembled the person I had once been. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the wall. The stone was slick with something, cold, wet, but as my fingers brushed against it, the wall seemed to pulse under my touch. It wasn't just the house I was touching. It was the thing that had been born from the house, the thing that fed on the souls of those it trapped. We are waiting for you. The whispers were now an insistent chorus, filling my mind, blocking out all other thoughts. I was part of them now. I had been claimed by the house, just like all the others before me. And then it happened. I felt it. The sharpness, the pain, like my soul was being torn from my body, a rending, a ripping of my very essence. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the walls, by the house that had become my prison. The shadows around me began to writhe and twist as if in agony, their forms contorting into monstrous shapes. The air grew thicker, darker, and I knew this was it. This was how it ended. But before I could fully understand what was happening, the darkness gave way, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flash of light. It wasn't the light of hope. It was the light of something dark, something that had always been there, just waiting to pull me back. I reached toward it, even as my body felt like it was being ripped apart. But then, the house, this cursed thing, pulled me back into its depths. The light faded. The darkness swallowed me whole. The darkness returned in an instant, consuming everything once more. My body felt like a marionette, puppet by the will of the house. I could no longer move, no longer fight. The whispers were louder now, pressing into my mind with relentless force. You are ours. I struggled to breathe, but there was nothing left to take in. The air was heavy, suffocating, filled with a stench that burned my throat and nostrils. The house had become my prison, and I was lost within its endless torment. But then, through the chaos, a faint voice broke through, soft, fragile, barely audible, yet piercing through the noise like a beacon. Let him go. It was a woman's voice, faint, almost ghostly, but full of determination and sorrow. It wasn't like the others. It wasn't one of the monstrous whispers or the guttural chants. It was different. Let him go. The voice seemed to come from far away, but with each repetition, it grew clearer, closer. The other voices faltered, their collective chorus momentarily disrupted. The shadows around me began to flicker, hesitating, unsure of what to do. Let him go. The words held an unseen power, a glimmer of hope amidst the overwhelming darkness. My mind clung to them, grasping at the single ray of light that refused to be extinguished. The voice was steady, unwavering, pulling me back from the abyss. Slowly, the darkness began to wane, retreating just enough to give me room to breathe. The oppressive weight lifted, if only slightly, and I could feel the tension in the air change. The shadows seemed to falter, their monstrous shapes warping and thinning. You cannot escape. The voice was still there, but it wavered, losing its grip on me. The woman's voice continued, unwavering. Let him go. This time, there was no hesitation. The house trembled. The shadows quivered, dissolving into nothingness. The oppressive darkness that had held me captive began to retreat, piece by piece, leaving behind only a fragile sliver of light. I gasped, drawing in breath as though I hadn't breathed in years. My body still felt the weight of the house's influence, but I was no longer paralyzed. I could move again, albeit slowly, cautiously. Who are you? I croaked, my voice hoarse and cracked. I am the one who fights for the lost. The voice remained steady, its sorrowful tone tempered with determination. The ones who came before, the ones who were taken by this house. I couldn't see her yet, but her words resonated deep within me. There was no fear in her voice, only resolve, a fierce, unyielding strength. Why are you here? I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. To protect those who cannot protect themselves, she said softly. You are not the first to fall into this darkness, and you will not be the last unless we stop it. The house groaned around us, the foundations trembling. The darkness fought back, lashing out in desperate attempts to reclaim what was slipping through its grasp. But the woman's voice held firm, a barrier against the encroaching abyss. We have to go, she urged. Now, I didn't hesitate. Every instinct told me that my only chance was to follow her. I moved toward the sound of her voice, each step a struggle against the residual darkness. The house seemed alive again, its presence desperate, clinging to its power as if it knew its time was running out. The light grew stronger with each step, but I could still feel the faint tendrils of fear lingering in my chest. The echoes of the shadows reached out, desperate to drag me back, but the woman's voice cut through them like a blade. Almost there, she reassured me, her voice steady, guiding me toward the exit. The air outside the house was crisp and cold-free. I stumbled into the open, gasping for breath, my body trembling uncontrollably. The house behind me shrieked in protest, but it was no longer the oppressive, suffocating force it had once been. "You're safe now," she said gently, her voice fading into the distance as she retreated into the darkness. I turned back to thank her, but she was already gone. The house, weakened and disoriented, stood silent once more. Its windows were dark, its doors shut tight, as though it had lost something essential, something it could never reclaim. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring back at the cursed house. The whispers had ceased, the shadows had faded, but the lingering chill in the air told me that the terror wasn't entirely over. As I walked away, I knew the house had claimed others before me, and it would seek out more. The cycle would continue unless someone, like the woman, stood against it. But as I moved forward, a question lingered in my mind. Would it ever stop? The answer was uncertain, and deep down, I knew it might never end. Days passed since I left the house, but the sense of dread never fully lifted. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows twisting and writhing in my mind's eye. I heard the faint echoes of whispers just out of reach, like a haunting melody I couldn't shake. The weight of it all, the house, the voices, the things I had seen, lingered in me, a shadow that refused to let go. I tried to go back to my life. I moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, far from the house. But no matter where I went, the fear followed. I couldn't escape it. I wasn't sure I wanted it anymore. The house was gone, but its presence was still with me, hiding just beneath the surface. I kept the lights on at night, the creaks in the floor, the whisper of the wind through the trees, the scratching of the walls. Every sound set me on edge. Even the smallest noise felt like it was pushing me back toward that house, toward the darkness. And then, a week later, it happened. I was sitting in my living room, reading a book to distract myself, when the temperature in the room dropped sharply. I could see my breath mist in the air, though the heater was on full blast. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I looked around the room, suddenly very aware of the silence around me. Then a creak, a sound so soft, so faint, I almost convinced myself it was my imagination. But I knew it wasn't. The sound came again, this time from the hallway outside my door. A slow, deliberate creak, like someone stepping onto a floorboard just out of sight. I froze, my heartbeat hammering in my chest. The door to my apartment was locked. There was no one else in the building. I knew this, yet the sound continued, closer now, like someone was walking toward me. The air around me grew colder still. I felt the darkness closing in. I stood up, unable to sit any longer, my mind racing. I reached for my phone and dialed the number of a friend, someone who might offer some comfort. But as I pressed the button, I noticed something strange. The screen was black. No signal. No power. I checked the battery. Fully charged. The phone had just turned off. A voice in the back of my mind whispered that I wasn't alone, that the house had found me again. The door to my apartment creaked open. I spun around, heart in my throat, but there was no one there. The door, which had been securely locked only moments before, stood wide open, the hallway beyond cloaked in shadow. The cold seeped into the room, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. The whispers came again, faint but unmistakable, like a chorus of distant voices calling my name. I didn't move. I couldn't. The footsteps continued down the hallway, growing louder now, each step coming closer. It was the same dragging, scraping sound I had heard in the house. The sound of something ancient, something that shouldn't be. And then I saw it, a figure, dark, indistinct, like a shadow stretching across the wall, its outline shifting and flickering. I could feel it watching me, its presence suffocating the very air. My breath caught in my throat as the figure moved, its step slow, deliberate, as if it knew exactly where I was. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The room around me seemed to close in, the walls pressing together, the floor buckling beneath my feet. The figure stopped just inside the doorway, and for the first time, I saw its face, or rather, the absence of one. The face was smooth, featureless, like a mask or a void, a black hole where its eyes and mouth should have been. I couldn't scream. My body was frozen, locked in place by fear. And then it spoke. "You cannot escape." The voice was distorted, echoing through the room like 1,000 voices speaking at once. The shadows around the figure seemed to warp, stretching toward me. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could feel the darkness seeping into my skin, into my bones. I knew, with every fiber of my being, that this was no coincidence. This thing, this presence, was tied to the house. It was a part of it, a fragment of whatever cursed the walls. And it had followed me. It took a step forward. I snapped back into motion. My legs, still trembling, propelled me toward the door. I didn't know what I was running from, but I knew I had to get out. The figure moved again, and the sound of its footsteps echoed behind me, following me, relentless. I bolted down the hallway, my pulse pounding in my ears, but as I turned the corner toward the stairs, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. The house, the very same house I had fled from, was right there in front of me, its windows dark, its door wide open, beckoning me back inside. The house had followed me. It had never let me go. I backed away, heart hammering in my chest, but the darkness seemed to creep closer, swallowing the light. The figure emerged from the shadows, its faceless mask staring at me, its presence bearing down like an insurmountable weight. "You are mine." The voice echoed again, louder, sharper, like a final judgment. The room grew colder, and the house loomed closer. It was no longer just a building. It was a prison. It was the end. The door to my apartment slammed shut behind me. The shadows closed in. The walls of my apartment seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, vibrating as if the very structure of the building was alive. My breath quickened, each inhale a struggle against the suffocating air that wrapped around me like a shroud. The shadows pressed in, filling the space, and I could no longer see the faint outlines of the furniture, the walls, or the door. All I saw were the shifting silhouettes, the twisting, flickering shapes that had once been so familiar. The figure with the faceless mask stood at the far end of the room, still waiting, its presence an inescapable force. The temperature had dropped even further, the cold now abiding, searing pain that seemed to freeze me from the inside out. "You cannot escape." The voice, my voice, but not mine, whispered from the darkness. It was everywhere. I could feel it crawling under my skin, inside my head, pressing against my very thoughts. I tried to move. I tried to run, to escape, but my legs felt as though they were made of stone, unable to carry me. The shadows around me thickened, swirling like a storm, trapping me in their endless void. But then I saw it. In the corner of my vision, barely perceptible, was a sliver of light. Faint at first, like a flickering candle in the dark. It was small, distant, but unmistakable. It was a door. The door. It stood against the far wall, hidden in the darkness, but its presence was undeniable. It wasn't like any door I had seen before. The frame was ancient, worn with time, its wood warped and cracked, but it was there. It beckoned. A voice inside me screamed to run toward it, to escape, but I knew better now. The house wouldn't let me leave. It would never let me go. The door was just another trick, another part of the trap. But I couldn't resist. I stumbled toward it, every step a battle against the weight of the shadows, against the pull of the figure in the corner. The house seemed to fight me, the floor buckling beneath my feet, the air thickening, becoming unbearable. I could hear the footsteps behind me again, the scraping sound growing louder with every passing second. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I grasped the cold, rusted handle. The moment I touched it, a surge of energy shot through me, like an electric shock. The room around me seemed to snap, like a taut wire breaking, and I could feel something else, a presence, an entity, pushing me away, trying to drag me back into the suffocating darkness. I turned the handle. The door creaked open, and for the briefest moment I saw light. Real, tangible light that pierced through the suffocating blackness like a beacon. It wasn't the light of the house, the false glow that had once deceived me. It was something pure, something real. The air shifted. The temperature began to rise. The house groaned in agony, its walls shaking as if in protest. The floorboards cracked under the weight of something ancient, something terrible, as if the very foundation of the building was crumbling around me. I stepped through the door, leaving the apartment behind, leaving the house, leaving the nightmare. The moment I crossed the threshold, the darkness shrieked in fury. The door slammed shut behind me, and I heard it. The sound of the house collapsing, crumbling, folding in on itself as though it had been undone. And then nothing. I stood in the light. The shadows were gone. The house was gone. The cold, suffocating air was gone. I took a deep breath, and it was real. It was fresh. I was free. But as I stood there, bathed in the light, I heard something else, soft, distant, but unmistakable. You cannot escape. The voice was faint now, as though it were a memory fading with time. But it lingered in the back of my mind, a whisper, a promise. The house had been destroyed, but it had never truly left. It was always there, just waiting, just beneath the surface, lurking in the shadows. I turned away from the light and looked down at my hands. They were shaking. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know how I had gotten here or what this place was, but I knew one thing. The door was only one of many, and the house? It was still waiting. Epilogue. The house is always watching. I couldn't sleep. It had been weeks since I walked through that door, weeks since the house had collapsed into dust and shadows. I had moved again, this time to a place far from the town, far from the memories. But the whispers never stopped. They followed me, faint but always there, just beyond my thoughts. One night, I sat at my desk, staring at the wall in front of me, when I heard it, a soft creak. I froze, the sound sending a chill through my spine. I turned toward the door, but it was locked. The windows were closed. I was alone, but the creak came again. I knew where it was from. I knew what it meant. The house hadn't been destroyed. It had simply moved on. It was waiting for someone else, and I would never be free. Story 3. I never thought I'd end up here, alone in a house that creaked like it was alive. The kind of place you see in movies and think, who would ever live there? But when you're newly divorced, drowning in paperwork and desperate for a fresh start, you take what you can get. The house was on the edge of town, a sagging 2-story structure with chipped paint and warped shutters. The rent was suspiciously low, but I convinced myself it was a lucky break. The landlord, a wiry man with a nervous laugh, said it had character and reassured me that the quirks were part of its charm. Old houses breathe, he said as I signed the lease. You'll get used to it. The first few days passed uneventfully. I spent my time unpacking, arranging furniture, and trying to fill the emptiness in the house and in my life. The floorboards groaned under every step. The pipes rattled when I turned on the water, and there was a faint, musty smell that no amount of cleaning seemed to fix. But I told myself it was fine. It was home now. On my third night, I met my neighbor, Mrs. Carruthers. an elderly woman who lived next door in a much tidier house with a neatly trimmed hedge. She introduced herself with a plate of cookies and a faintly pitying smile. "You moved into the old Hammond place," she said, her tone heavy with implication. "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound cheerful. "It's a little rough around the edges, but it's got potential." She didn't smile. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder at my house, as if expecting it to react. "You know about the others who live there, right?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Not really," I said, feeling a flicker of unease. The landlord didn't say much. Mrs. Carruthers hesitated, then leaned in closer. "People don't stay long. Last tenant ran out in the middle of the night. Said something about hearing voices and footsteps. Before that, there was a family, lovely folks, but they left just as quickly. Couldn't bear the disturbances." I laughed nervously, brushing off her words. "It's an old house. Probably just noisy pipes or something." She didn't look convinced. "Just be careful," she said, patting my arm. "Some places remember things better left forgotten." That night, I lay in bed, replaying her words in my mind. The house seemed quieter than usual, almost as if it were holding its breath. Around midnight, the noises began. The first sound was faint, so faint I thought I'd imagined it. A soft creak, like weight pressing on an old floorboard. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, but all I heard was the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I told myself it was nothing. Old houses made noises. The landlord had said so, right? I settled back down, pulling the blanket over my shoulders. The room was cold, but it had been cold every night since I moved in. I drifted off eventually, but my sleep was shallow and restless, filled with strange, half-formed dreams. The next morning, I found myself brushing off the night's unease. I convinced myself I was just tired, still adjusting to a new place. I went through my usual routine: coffee, emails, errands, trying to make the house feel a little less empty. It was while I was unpacking a box of books that I noticed something odd. A faint but distinct smell, earthy and sour, like damp soil. It was strongest in the living room near the baseboards. I crouched down, running my fingers along the edge of the floor. Nothing. I made a mental note to mention it to the landlord and moved on. That night, the sounds came back. I was in bed again, staring at the ceiling when I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak, followed by another. It wasn't random this time. It was rhythmic, like footsteps. My heart thudded as I sat up, holding my breath. The sound stopped. For a long moment, the house was silent again. I exhaled, feeling foolish. It's just the house settling, I told myself. Or maybe I'm imagining things. But then, just as I was about to lie down, I heard it again. Closer this time. The unmistakable sound of someone, or something, walking across the floor downstairs. I froze, my mind racing. Could it be a burglar? I grabbed my phone and tiptoed to the bedroom door, holding it half open. The hallway stretched out before me, dark and quiet. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. Summoning what little courage I had, I crept downstairs, flipping on every light switch along the way. The living room was empty. The kitchen, too. Every door was locked, the windows bolted. There was no sign of anyone or anything being there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I barely slept that night. Every small sound set my nerves on edge. By morning, I had convinced myself I was overreacting. Stress, I thought. Maybe I was letting Mrs. Carruthers' story get into my head. But the unease lingered. A few days later, I decided to do some digging. If the house had a history, I wanted to know about it. I started with the town library, scrolling through old newspaper archives on a creaky computer. That's when I found it. An article from 1974. Local historian found dead in mysterious circumstances. The name leapt out at me. Henry Hammond. My stomach twisted as I read the details. Hammond had been the house's original owner, a reclusive man obsessed with the occult, known for hosting strange gatherings in the house. He died alone, found in the basement surrounded by bizarre symbols and burned candles. The coroner had ruled it a heart attack, but neighbors at the time had whispered about darker causes. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. Had I moved into a house with a curse? The discovery about Henry Hammond sent a chill through me that I couldn't shake. I kept thinking about the man's obsession with the occult, the strange symbols, the rumors. The more I tried to push the thoughts out of my mind, the more they stuck. What if there was something to Mrs. Carruthers' warnings? What if the house wasn't just old and creaky, but haunted? That night, I tried to convince myself to relax. I made tea, settled on the couch with a book, and turned on the TV. Anything to drown out the growing unease. The house, however, didn't make it easy. I'd been sitting there for nearly an hour when I heard it again. The same creak, the same steady footsteps. This time, they weren't coming from downstairs. They were coming from above me, the floorboards and the ceiling groaning under the weight of something heavy. I stood up so fast I knocked over the tea mug. It shattered with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the empty house. My heart pounded as I looked toward the stairs that led to the attic. No one was up there. No one could be up there. I hadn't even been in the attic yet, and it was locked. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, moving in a circle above me. I grabbed the broom from the corner and shakily ascended the stairs. Each step creaked under my feet, the air colder with every movement. The attic door loomed at the top of the stairs, its old, brass handle gleaming faintly in the dim light. I reached for the handle, but before I could turn it, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. My hand hovered over the doorknob, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. What was I doing? I wasn't a believer in ghosts or curses, at least I didn't think I was. But something in this house, something felt wrong. I opened the door. The attic was dark and musty. The light bulb overhead flickered once before dying completely. I stepped inside, using the light from my phone to scan the room. It was filled with old furniture covered in dust, forgotten relics of the house's past. But then I saw it, a stack of old books, bound in leather, with strange symbols etched into the covers. They were piled haphazardly in the far corner of the attic, half hidden under a moth-eaten sheet. I felt drawn to them, like something was pulling me closer. My hand trembled as I reached out and pulled the top book from the pile. The pages inside were brittle, yellowed with age. It didn't take much to realize that these weren't ordinary books. They were journals, diaries perhaps. The first entry I read was from Henry Hammond himself. His handwriting was frantic, almost desperate. Asterisk, the rituals are working. I can feel the presence growing stronger. The door is opening. It's getting closer. Asterisk, a chill crawled down my spine. I flipped through more pages, each entry more disturbing than the last. His obsession with the occult had grown in intensity. He had performed rituals in the house, trying to summon something dark and powerful. But the entries became increasingly erratic, as though he'd been slowly losing his mind. Asterisk, it's here. The door is open. I've made a terrible mistake. Asterisk, the last entry was barely legible. A rushed scrawl that sent a wave of dread over me. Asterisk, I'm not alone. It's not just in the house. It's in my head. Asterisk. Suddenly, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Not from above this time, but from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the creeping, suffocating silence of the attic. I backed away from the books, my heart racing. I slammed the door shut and rushed back down the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just uncovered something I wasn't supposed to know. That night, I lay in bed. The pages of Henry Hammond's journal burned into my mind. The footsteps continued, louder now, as if the house itself was alive, waiting for something, or someone. I was starting to believe that Mrs. Carruthers had been right. This house wasn't just haunted. It was alive with something that had never fully been put to rest. I couldn't sleep that night, no matter how many times I rolled over. Trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, my mind kept returning to the journals. I couldn't get Henry Hammond out of my head. The rituals, the madness, the door he had opened. What had he invited into this house? Every creak of the floorboards, every subtle shift in the house made my blood run cold. The house had changed overnight. It wasn't just old and decaying anymore. It was watching me. I could feel it. By morning, the unease had shifted into something more insidious, paranoia. I couldn't even step into the kitchen without hearing a soft tapping on the walls. I jumped at the sound of my own footsteps, and when I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror, my face was pale, my eyes wide and bloodshot. I needed to get out. I needed to leave, but I didn't want to seem weak, like I was giving in to some ghost story from a crazy old woman next door. I decided to take a walk, to clear my head. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the town as I walked aimlessly, my mind racing. I passed Mrs. Carruthers' house, hoping to run into her, but there was no sign of her. I was about to head back when I noticed something strange. A small alley, narrow and overgrown, tucked behind a row of houses. I'd never seen it before. I felt the urge to explore it. Something was pulling me toward it, a magnetic force I couldn't explain. The alley was cramped and smelled of rot. At the end, half hidden by vines, was a small door, an old wooden door, barely visible behind the overgrowth. Something about it felt familiar. I hesitated, my heart pounding. Should I really go through with this? I glanced back toward the main street. No one was around. The alley was quiet. The door, old as it was, seemed to beckon me forward. I pushed it open. On the other side was a tiny, decrepit yard, just big enough for a couple of steps. The air was thick with a strange, choking stillness. I looked around, but there was nothing to see but a dilapidated shed, its door hanging off one hinge. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I turned to leave, but just before I stepped back into the alley, I saw something in the shed's cracked window, a shape just out of reach of the light, a figure. I froze. It was a man, standing completely still, his back to me. His posture was unnaturally rigid, like a statue. The light didn't seem to touch him. I backed away, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't even look back to see if he was still there. I ran, not stopping until I was back in the safety of my house. It wasn't until I locked the door behind me that I realized how much my hands were shaking. I didn't know what I had seen, whether it was a person or something else. But one thing was certain. I wasn't safe anymore. The footsteps started again that night. But this time, they weren't coming from upstairs. They were coming from inside my room. I woke to the sound of heavy breathing. It was ragged, slow, and close. So close that I could almost feel the warmth of it on the back of my neck. My heart slammed against my ribcage. I didn't move. I didn't dare to breathe. Then I heard the sound of something or someone shifting on the bed beside me. The mattress dipped under an unseen weight. I felt it, a cold presence, something pressing down beside me, sitting there in the dark. And then the whispering began. It was soft at first, a low murmur that I couldn't quite make out. It was coming from the other side of the room, from the corner where the shadows clung. The voice was raspy, like someone who hadn't spoken in years. The words, they were in a language I didn't understand, but I felt them. Every syllable chilled my blood, made my skin crawl. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. I finally mustered the courage to glance toward the corner. There, standing in the shadow, was a figure. It was Henry Hammond. I could see his face clearly now, even though the room was dark. His eyes were wide, hollow, and unblinking. His mouth hung open, as though he were trying to speak, but no words came out. only that horrid whispering. I scrambled out of bed, my feet tangling in the sheets. I was dizzy, disoriented, but I didn't care. I ran from the room, down the hall, and out the door. The night air hit me like a slap in the face. The house loomed behind me, silent now, as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. I could still hear the whispers, faint but clear in the back of my mind. They were calling to me, and Henry Hammond wasn't the only one. I didn't sleep that night. Not at all. I sat in the living room, with the lights blazing, too terrified to go back to my room, too shaken to even think about the attic. The whispers lingered in the corners of my mind, like a bad taste in my mouth I couldn't get rid of. Every noise, every creak of the house made my skin prickle. It felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting, watching. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay there anymore. I had to leave, but where could I go? Everything in me screamed to pack up and never look back, but the thought of leaving the house, it felt like running from something I didn't fully understand, something that had already marked me. I tried to go about my day like usual. I needed to calm down, get a grip, so I grabbed my jacket and went out for a walk. Maybe some fresh air would clear my head. But as I stepped onto the street, I caught sight of Mrs. Carruthers sitting in her front yard. She was staring directly at me, her sharp eyes watching with a knowing expression. I hesitated, then walked over. She didn't say anything at first. She just sat there, her hands folded in her lap, as though she was waiting for me to speak. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. What's going on? Why does this house feel so wrong? My voice was shaky, but I didn't care. I needed to know. Mrs. Carruthers' face softened, but there was something distant about her gaze. You've seen it, haven't you? She asked quietly. I nodded, too afraid to speak the words aloud. She sighed and looked down at her hands. I knew you would. The house, it's never been right. Henry Hammond, he didn't just invite something into this place. He opened it, and it's been waiting ever since. Waiting for what? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't name. For someone to listen, she stood up slowly, her old bones creaking, and stepped closer to me. For someone to take part in what he started, I felt a cold rush of air, even though the sun was beating down on us. I stepped back, shaking my head. I don't want any part of it. I just want to leave. You can't leave, she said, her voice low. You're already in it. You moved in, didn't you? You're tied to it now. You've crossed the threshold, and it won't let you go. It never does. Her words hit me like a slap, but I couldn't bring myself to walk away. Why didn't you tell me? I demanded. Why didn't you warn me? She glanced at the house behind me, a shadow crossing her face. I've tried to warn everyone, but they don't listen. No one listens until it's too late. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. But it's your choice now. There's still time. Time to close the door. I stared at her, bewildered. Close the doors? I repeated, unsure if I had heard her right. The door, Henry, opened, she said, her voice barely audible. The one that's still open. The one that lets it in. Asterisk, asterisk? I asked, feeling my throat tighten. Mrs. Carruthers nodded gravely. Whatever was waiting on the other side, whatever Henry let in, I took a step back, the weight of her words pressing down on me. The idea of some kind of doorway to a dark world, something that could cross over into this one, it was too much to process. Where is it? I asked before I could stop myself. How do I close it? Her eyes darkened, and I saw something there, something I hadn't noticed before. Fear. Deep, abiding fear. It's here, she whispered, her voice trembling. In the house. The door, it's in the basement. My blood ran cold. The basement, of course. The one part of the house I had avoided since I moved in. The one place I hadn't dared to explore. You have to go down there, Mrs. Carruthers continued, her voice low and urgent. You have to find the door, and you have to close it. Before it finds you, I felt my stomach churn, nausea rising in my throat. What happens if I don't? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Her face twisted with pity. It will take you, just like it took all the others. I didn't wait for her to say anything else. I turned and ran back toward the house, my mind spinning. I couldn't stay. I couldn't leave. The only way out was to close the door, whatever that meant. The house loomed before me like a living, breathing thing, its windows dark and empty. As I stepped inside, the air grew heavier, colder. The smell of decay clung to the walls. The footsteps started again. They were closer this time. I swallowed hard and made my way down the hall, toward the basement door at the end. The house seemed to groan under the weight of something impatient. I took a deep breath, grabbed the doorknob, and opened it. The basement stairs descended into absolute darkness. A cold, musty air wafted up from below, carrying with it the scent of something old, ancient. I stepped forward, the air growing colder with each step. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a flicker of movement, like something watching me from the shadows. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was too late to turn back now. The air in the basement was thick with the smell of mildew and rot. But it was more than that. It felt heavy, as though something was pressing down on me from all sides. I couldn't see much beyond the stairs, the darkness almost swallowing me whole as I descended. Each step creaked underfoot, and I thought for a moment that the house itself was groaning in pain. I could feel the presence now, the sensation of being watched, of something ancient and cold lurking in the shadows. The whispers, faint but unmistakable, filled the air around me. They seemed to come from all directions, voices I couldn't understand, murmuring in an unintelligible language, growing louder with each step I took toward the bottom. The stairs ended in a small, low-ceilinged room. The walls were damp with condensation, and the floor was covered in dust and debris. But it was what I saw in the far corner that made my blood run cold. A door. It was old, older than the house itself it seemed, made of dark, weathered wood, with strange symbols carved into it. I stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest. The air around it felt charged, as if the door was alive, pulsing with a dark energy. I could almost hear it, an almost imperceptible hum, a vibration deep within my bones. I had found it. The door Henry Hammond had opened all those years ago. The door that had invited something into this world. I reached for the handle, but as soon as my fingers brushed it, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs of cold air. A wave of nausea hit me, and I staggered back, gasping for breath. It was here, the thing that Hammond had summoned, the thing that had been waiting. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me, scratching at my mind. And then I heard it, a low growl, like an animal in pain, coming from the other side of the door. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave, to forget everything I had learned. But I couldn't. Not now. I had come this far. I had to close the door. I gathered all my courage and reached for the handle again. This time, when I touched it, there was a jolt, like an electric shock, shooting through my body. My vision blurred for a moment, and the whispers turned to a scream. I jerked the door open. At first, nothing happened. The room behind the door was empty, dark, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I had imagined everything. But then, I felt it, the pressure, the weight of something immense pressing against the air. I could hear the growling again, louder now, unmistakable. And in the darkness of the room, something moved. It was fast, too fast for me to react. A shadow, darker than the room around it, darted toward me with terrifying speed. I slammed the door shut. For a moment, everything was still. But then, the whispering started again, closer this time, as though it was right next to me. I could feel it behind me, pressing against my back, the air freezing cold and thick with something rotten. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. And there it was, a figure, standing in the doorway. Henry Hammond. His face was twisted, pale, and gaunt. His eyes were wide, unblinking but lifeless. He was no longer human. Something else had taken his place. His body trembled, his mouth moving soundlessly as he reached toward me. I stumbled back, my legs too weak to support me, and fell hard onto the basement floor. My breath caught in my throat as I scrambled backward, away from him, my eyes locked on the horrific figure. The room grew colder, the whispers louder, until I thought my mind would break from the pressure. I was trapped, and then I heard the door behind me creak open again. I looked back toward the basement door. The dark, empty room behind it was no longer empty. It was alive, filled with shadows, with things I couldn't name, with eyes watching me from every corner. They were waiting. They were all waiting. I didn't have a choice. I had to close the door. I had to stop it. I scrambled to my feet and ran toward the door. As my hand reached for the handle, I felt something cold wrap around my wrist. I looked down and saw Henry's hand, skeletal and cold as ice, gripping my arm with terrifying strength. I screamed, my voice barely making it past my throat, but I yanked my arm free. I slammed the door shut again, the force of it making the walls tremble. I didn't wait to see what would happen. I turned and fled, running up the stairs, my heart in my throat, the cold, heavy air choking me. The house seemed to groan in response, its walls shifting as though it was waking up, angry. I ran through the hall, past the kitchen and straight out the front door. The air outside felt like a bomb to my burning lungs, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. I don't know how long I ran, but when I finally stopped, panting and exhausted, I found myself at the edge of the town, looking back at the house. It stood there, silent, dark, watching me. And that's when I heard it again. The whispers. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. They were calling to me, pulling me back. They were not finished with me yet. The house had won. I couldn't escape it. No matter how far I ran, how many blocks I put between myself and that cursed house, the whispers stayed with me. They followed me like an echo, growing louder the more I tried to push them away. I could feel them creeping under my skin, burrowing into my mind, filling the spaces between my thoughts. I didn't go back to my apartment. I couldn't. The idea of stepping foot in that house again was too much to bear. But I had no other options. I didn't know where to go or what to do. The house had marked me. Asterisk whatever asterisk was inside, whatever Henry Hammond had let loose. It wasn't done with me yet. I found myself wandering the streets aimlessly, my legs moving faster than my mind could process. The town seemed quieter than usual, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I passed people, but their faces blurred, as if they were nothing more than shadows. My thoughts were consumed by the house, by the door I'd opened, by Henry's twisted, lifeless form. I didn't realize where I was until I found myself standing in front of Mrs. Carruthers' house. It wasn't the safest place, but she was the only one who had warned me. She was the only one who knew what I was dealing with. I knocked, my hand trembling as I did. The door creaked open, and there she was. Her face was solemn, as though she'd been expecting me. "I knew you'd come back," she said softly, stepping aside to let me in. I didn't say anything. I just stepped over the threshold and into the dimly lit hallway. It felt like a different world in here. Quieter, more peaceful, but the tension, the sense of dread, was still there, lingering like an unspoken truth. "Sit down," Mrs. Carruthers said, gesturing to a worn armchair near the fireplace. "You need to hear what happened before, what Henry did." I sat, grateful for the chance to rest my legs, but my mind was far away. The whispers had quieted for now, but I could still feel them, clawing at the edges of my awareness. Mrs. Carruthers settled across from me, her eyes studying me carefully. "You need to understand something," she began, her voice low and measured. "This town, the house you're in, it's all connected. It's been cursed for generations. The curse started with Henry Hammond, but it didn't end with him. It's never ended." I leaned forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you mean? Why is it still happening? Why me?" She sighed, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something dark in her eyes, something that made my skin crawl. "Because you're connected now. You've opened the door. You're tied to it, just like everyone before you." I shook my head, but I didn't know. I didn't mean to. "It doesn't matter," she interrupted. "Intentions don't change the reality. Once that door is opened, once the curse is set in motion, it can't be undone. The thing behind it, it wants out. It's always hungry." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I remembered the growls, the shadows behind the door, and Henry's twisted form. "Henry," I whispered, barely able to speak the name. "He's not dead, is he?" Mrs. Carruthers' expression darkened. "No, he was never truly alive again after what he did. He's been changed, just like the others. It's part of the curse. You see, Henry didn't just summon a spirit or a demon. He opened a door to something far older, something beyond this world. And when it came through, it didn't just take him. It took everyone." My breath caught in my throat. Everyone who's lived in that house," she confirmed, "and many before them. It feeds on souls, on fear. It waits for the right moment to take what it wants. And now that you've opened the door, it knows you. It has claimed you." I sat back in the chair, my chest tight with panic. "I don't understand. Why hasn't it taken me yet?" She gave a small, sad smile. "Because it's playing with you. It's letting you think you can run. But in the end, it will always get what it wants. And when it's ready, you'll know. It's already inside you." I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. It was too much to take in, too much for my mind to process. But the cold, aching sense of dread in my gut told me that every word she was saying was true. "What can I do?" I asked, my voice breaking. "How do I stop it?" Mrs. Carruthers shook her head. "There's nothing you can do. Once the door's opened, it's too late. You can't close it. You can't banish it. It's already here." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. There was no escape, no hope. The door slammed open behind me, and I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The room was cold, too cold. I didn't even need to turn around to know what it was. I could feel it. The air was thick with the presence of something wrong, something unnatural. Slowly, I turned, and there it was, a figure, standing in the doorway. But it wasn't Henry anymore. It was something worse, something darker, more twisted. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and its mouth stretched impossibly wide, as though it were smiling at me. The room seemed to grow darker, as if the light itself was being sucked away. Mrs. Carruthers didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stared at me, her face an expression of hopeless resignation. I stood up, my legs unsteady. I had no choice. I had to run, but it was too late. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I grasped the knob, and then I felt it, a hand, cold as ice, grasping my wrist. I didn't scream. I didn't have the strength. The thing was already inside me. I couldn't breathe. My chest was constricted, my body paralyzed by an icy cold that wrapped around me like a vice. The thing, whatever it was holding me, its grip unrelenting. I felt it tightening, dragging me backward, its presence suffocating. The whispers grew louder, the voices becoming clearer, their words no longer just incomprehensible murmurs but piercing, guttural commands. They were speaking to me now, clawing at my mind. I tried to scream, but my mouth wouldn't open. My legs felt like lead, weighed down by an invisible force. I struggled against the grip, but it was as if my body had ceased to obey me. And then I realized, asterisk, I couldn't escape Star. The room around me had warped. The walls were closing in, the floor seeming to shift beneath my feet. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and writhe, and in that moment I knew. I knew that it wasn't just in the house anymore. It wasn't just confined to the basement. Whatever it was, it had followed me here, and it had claimed me. I could feel its breath on my skin, cold, wet, suffocating. I couldn't look at it. I was too afraid to turn around, too terrified to see its form. But I could feel its eyes on me, cold and soulless, boring into my very being. Then, through the thick haze of terror clouding my mind, I heard Mrs. Carruthers. She was standing behind me now, her voice as soft and fragile as a thread. "It's too late," she whispered, her tone as sad as it was resigned. "You opened the door, and now it has you. There's no way out." "No," I gasped, my body trembling. "I know. I can't." "You can't escape," she repeated, her voice now shaking with fear. "It's already inside you. It feeds on your fear. You'll never be free of it." I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. I knew what I was going to see. I could feel it in every inch of my skin. But when I faced her, when I looked into Mrs. Carruthers' eyes, I saw nothing. Her body was there, standing before me, but her eyes were hollow, empty, lifeless. She wasn't there anymore. She had already been claimed. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. My body was frozen, suspended in time. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I couldn't... A piercing scream cut through the suffocating silence. My own scream. I hadn't even realized I was making the sound until it filled the room, echoed off the walls, and then it stopped. I couldn't hear anything anymore. There was nothing, just silence. I blinked, shaking my head. My thoughts were a blur. My mind struggling to hold on to something real, something tangible. But all that was left was the suffocating cold, the whispering voices, the oppressive darkness. I was no longer standing in Mrs. Carruthers' house. No, the world had shifted again. The room was unfamiliar, the air dense, thick with a presence that made my skin crawl. I was back in the basement. The door that had once been locked behind me was wide open now. And behind it, beyond the threshold, I saw nothing but blackness, a void stretching out into infinity. I took a step forward, though every part of me screamed to turn away. The whispering was growing louder again, like 1,000 voices speaking at once, all urging me to step into the darkness. I hesitated, then I heard it, a faint, familiar voice. "Come." It was Henry Hammond's voice, but it was wrong. It was twisted. I had to move forward. I didn't have a choice. Something was pulling me, dragging me into the blackness. My feet carried me without my permission, as though my body had turned against me. The coldness pressed down harder, smothering me. The whispers were almost deafening now. They were no longer in my ears, but inside my mind. The voices had merged into one, a singular, monstrous entity. Asterisk, you are ours. Asterisk, I reached the edge of the doorway, the void in front of me. I couldn't see beyond it, but I could feel it, a void that was alive, waiting for me. It reached out, a mass of tendrils, dark shapes and figures swirling in the pitch black, like fingers pulling me in. I stumbled back, panic rising like bile in my throat, but there was no escaping it. The thing had me. I had already crossed the threshold. It was waiting for me, and then I felt it, the sensation of nothing. I was falling into an endless, consuming darkness. No, 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 no. But my thoughts were being swallowed. The weight of the house, of the curse, of whatever Henry had opened, it was all pressing down on me. It was inside me now. My scream echoed, but it was swallowed by the blackness. And then, all at once, everything stopped. I woke up. I didn't know where I was at first. My surroundings were dim, unfamiliar. The air felt heavy, still, and cold. I blinked, trying to make sense of what was happening. I could hear a faint sound in the distance, a scratching noise, like fingernails running down a surface. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My body was stiff, unresponsive, as though I was trapped inside it. I was lying on the floor. The ground beneath me was rough, uneven, and cold. When I tried to lift my hand to touch my face, I realized something. My skin, it wasn't mine anymore. It was gray, cold, lifeless. It's not over. The words echoed in my mind, growing louder with each passing second. I was still here. I struggled, but my limbs refused to obey. My body felt like it was made of stone, each movement slow, deliberate, as if I were a puppet on strings I couldn't control. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My throat was dry, constricted, like a vice tightening around it. The silence was suffocating. Even the scratching sound in the distance had ceased, leaving only the heavy, oppressive stillness behind. And then I felt it, a pull. Deep inside me, a tugging, twisting sensation that came from within my chest. It was as though something was trying to claw its way out of me. From the inside, my heart raced and the pressure built, constricting tighter until it felt like my very soul was being wrenched free. I gasped for air, but it didn't help. The coldness had seeped into every fiber of my being, leaving me numb. The air smelled thick, earthy, like damp soil and rot, but there was something more to it, something rancid, like decay. The darkness around me began to shift, to move. I could sense shapes now, figures in the shadows, silent, unmoving, but there, watching, waiting, and then I saw it, a faint glow, like a distant firefly, flickering in the corner of my vision. At first, it was nothing more than a speck of light, but as my mind sharpened, as my senses became more attuned to the space around me, the glow grew, expanding into a faint outline of a figure. It was tall, too tall. The air thickened even more, and I felt the weight of its presence pressing down on me, suffocating me, pulling me deeper into whatever world this was, whatever place I had ended up. The figure moved, its shape shifting and warping in ways that defied all logic, twisting and bending like a shadow being pulled in every direction. I couldn't take my eyes off it. I tried to move, to scramble away, but my body was frozen, rooted to the ground, unwilling to move. And then the voice came. It was soft, almost tender, yet filled with a cold, malevolent power. Asterisk, you've come so far, haven't you? Asterisk, I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was caught in the grip of something far more powerful than my fear. Asterisk, we've been waiting for you, waiting for the one who would open the door. Asterisk, I tried to scream again, but no sound came. The words, those terrible words, wrapped themselves around my mind, clawing at my thoughts, forcing me to understand. It wasn't just a house. It wasn't just Hammond. Whatever this was, whatever had taken root here, had always been waiting for someone like me. Someone who would find the door, who would walk through it without understanding. And now that I was here, it was too late. It was already inside me. The figure stepped closer, and I could feel the air change, the temperature dropping until it felt like I was suffocating in ice. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It reached toward me, its fingers impossibly long, its skin smooth and translucent, like something not quite human. I shut my eyes, tears filling them, but I could still feel it. The fingers, cold and sharp, brushed my face. A cold sensation, like death itself, spread from where it touched me, moving through my skin, reaching deep into my bones. The whispering returned, now louder, more forceful. The voices grew into a maddening cacophony, all speaking at once, as if the house itself were alive, breathing, watching, feeding off my fear. Asterisk, you are ours now. asterisk, and then, as if in response to the words, I felt it, a deep, primal terror flooding through me. I felt like I was being pulled apart, shredded from the inside out. My vision blurred, my body fading away, losing its shape. There was no escape, but just as I thought I might disappear completely, just as I thought the darkness would consume me entirely, a faint light pierced through the gloom, cutting through the suffocating blackness. It wasn't bright, but it was enough to pull me out of the depths of my fear, enough to remind me of something I'd forgotten. Hope! For a brief, fleeting moment, the sensation of something solid, something real, returned to me. The shadows recoiled as if they, too, were afraid of the light. But then the light flickered, and it was gone. The darkness swallowed everything again, and the figure was back, its face now inches from mine. It smiled. I didn't know how much time passed. I couldn't tell if I had been lost in the void for seconds or hours. All I knew was that I was still there, still trapped. The thing inside me was growing stronger, feeding off my terror, feeding off my fear. It wanted me. I was nothing more than a vessel now. I woke again, but this time I didn't feel the same. There was something in the air, something familiar but wrong. I could hear the distant thumping of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoing through the space around me. The air smelled of old wood, dust, and mildew, the same scent I'd grown accustomed to in the house. I looked around. I was back in the house, but it wasn't the same house. The walls were rotting, decaying, and the floor creaked underfoot. Everything was dim, bathed in an eerie, sickly light that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. The shadows in the corners moved as if they had a life of their own, swirling and shifting. The house was alive. And then I saw it. The door. It was the same door. The one I had opened so many days ago. The one that had changed everything. But it was different now. The carvings on the wood had twisted, grown more intricate, darker, as if the door itself had evolved. The air around it hummed with a low, pulsing energy, and I could feel it in my chest, pounding, vibrating. It was calling me. I knew I had no choice. I reached for the handle. The door was cold under my hand, its surface rough, the carvings twisting in a grotesque pattern. It felt alive, like it was pulsing, breathing beneath my fingers. My breath quickened, my chest tight with fear, but I knew I couldn't stop. The door had called me, and now there was no turning back. I gripped the handle, and as I turned it, a low hum filled the room, vibrating through the walls, the floor, and deep into my bones. The air thickened, pressing in on me from all sides, suffocating, as though the house itself was alive, watching me, waiting. The door creaked open, its hinges groaning in protest, and as the space beyond was revealed, my heart lurched. I could see nothing at first, just darkness, an endless void that stretched far beyond what should have been possible. But then, slowly, the shadows parted and something moved. It was Henry. No, it wasn't Henry, but the figure of Henry, twisted and mangled in ways that defied all understanding. His body was an unnatural shape, his limbs bent at odd angles, his face stretched into a grotesque mockery of what it once was. His eyes, once human, were now deep, hollow pits of darkness, and his mouth opened wide, emitting a sound that wasn't a scream but something far worse, something that scraped at the very edges of my sanity. I stepped back, horrified, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away, unable to tear myself from the sight. The thing, whatever it was, staggered forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, dragging its twisted form toward me. And then, as it reached out for me, its fingers curling into claws, I heard the whispers again. It's time. The voice was everywhere, all around me, inside me. I felt it, in my very soul, pulling me toward the thing that was once Henry. It was a hunger, a deep, gnawing desire to consume. But I didn't want to be consumed. With every ounce of willpower I had left, I wrenched myself away, stumbling backward, my heart racing as the coldness of the house pressed against me. I had to escape. I had to. The door slammed shut. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I looked around. The room was different now. The walls were closing in, the shadows growing longer, more oppressive. I was trapped. There was no escape. The whispers grew louder, closer, until they filled my ears, filled my head. You belong to us now. The words reverberated in my skull, and I could feel the presence of the thing that had been waiting for me, that had been feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every moment. It was in me, and there was nothing I could do. I collapsed to the ground, my mind unraveling, the darkness closing in around me. It felt like the house was consuming me, like I was becoming part of it, part of the curse. I could see the faces of those who had come before me, trapped in this nightmare, their souls lost forever to whatever malevolent force ruled this place. I didn't want to join them, but it was too late. The last thing I felt was the cold fingers of the thing that had claimed me, curling around my wrist, dragging me into the darkness. The door opened again, but it was no longer just a door. It was a void, a chasm, and I could see it now. The thing, its eyes glowing in the blackness, waiting, hungry. I screamed, but it didn't matter. No sound reached my lips. No one would hear. No one could save me. I was already gone. The house sat still. Its walls, its doors, its windows, the same as they had always been. But inside, the whispers never stopped. Another soul had joined the collection, and the door was still open, waiting for the next one. The end.